I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town surrounded by forests, I spent countless weekends hiking, fishing, and camping with my dad. Those trips instilled a love for nature that stayed with me into adulthood. But this particular trip, this solo camping trip, was the one that made me question whether some trails should just stay forgotten. It started innocently enough. I'd been working long hours at my job and needed a break. The thought of sitting at my desk one more day made my skin crawl. I craved silence, the kind you only find deep in the woods, away from the hum of city life. So, I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and my trusty GPS, and drove out to a forest I'd visited once as a kid. The forest was part of a national park, but it wasn't one of the well-known ones. The main trails were easy to find, and the parking lot had a few other cars when I arrived. But I wasn't interested in the main trails. I wanted solitude. I'd done some research and found an old trail on a map. It wasn't maintained anymore and didn't appear on most modern park maps. It seemed perfect, untouched, quiet, and remote. I downloaded the coordinates and made sure my GPS was charged. My plan was simple. Hike in about 8 miles, set up camp, spend 2 nights, and hike back out. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The trailhead was easy to find, and the path was still visible, though overgrown in places. Birds chirped in the trees, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Around mile 3, the trail started to get tricky. Fallen branches and thick undergrowth made it hard to follow. I pulled out my GPS to confirm I was still on track. The device showed the faint trail winding deeper into the forest. I pushed on, stepping over logs and brushing aside thorny vines. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 6 miles. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier than I remembered, but I was too stubborn to stop early. I wanted to reach the 8-mile mark before setting up camp. I pressed on as the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead. The air felt cooler, and the shadows lengthened. At mile 7, I noticed something odd. The forest was eerily quiet. The bird song had stopped, and even the rustle of leaves in the wind seemed muted. It wasn't unsettling at first, just strange. I told myself the birds had probably settled for the night and kept walking. Then I saw the clearing. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked perfect for camping. The ground was flat, and there was a small stream nearby. I decided to stop there, even though it was slightly shy of my 8-mile goal. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and started setting up my tent. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The clearing felt unnatural, like it didn't belong. The trees surrounding it were gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened in places. I dismissed the thought as exhaustion and focused on building a small fire. Night fell quickly. The stars blinked through gaps in the canopy, and the fire crackled softly. I ate a simple meal and settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the stream gurgling nearby. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence pressed down on me, making every little noise, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, seem magnified. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone or something was moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Morning brought a sense of relief. The sunlight streaming through the trees made the clearing seem less sinister. I packed up and decided to explore a bit before heading back. My GPS showed an interesting ridge not far from the clearing, so I left my pack and hiked up to check it out. The ridge was beautiful, offering a view of the forest stretching out in every direction. But as I turned to head back, I realized something chilling. I couldn't see the clearing. It should have been visible through the trees, But it wasn't. Panic set in as I realized I might be lost. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen was blank. I tried turning it off and on again, but it wouldn't boot up. My compass was back with my pack, so I tried to retrace my steps, marking trees with a knife to avoid walking in circles. It felt like hours before I stumbled back into the clearing. My relief was short-lived. My pack was there, untouched, but the fire pit I'd built was gone. The ground where it had been was smooth, like no fire had ever been there. I grabbed my pack and decided to leave immediately. I didn't care about finishing my plan 2 nights. I just wanted out. I used my compass to find the direction back to the trail and started walking. But the trail was gone. The path I'd followed into the clearing was no longer there. I wandered in what I thought was the right direction, only to find myself back at the clearing. It took me an entire day to find my way back to the main trail. By the time I reached it, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and on edge. The moment I saw another hiker, I almost cried. Looking back, I still don't know what happened. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. Maybe the forest was playing tricks on me. Or maybe some places are better left unexplored. All I know is I'll never forget that clearing, and I'll never go back. I had always considered myself an experienced camper. Over the years, I'd spent countless nights outdoors, from the well-trodden trails in Vermont to secluded alpine meadows in Switzerland. Camping was my way of disconnecting, a chance to breathe in the crisp air and hear nothing but the whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But nothing could have prepared me for that trip, a trip that would make me question my skills and my judgment. It was late September when I decided to camp alone in a remote forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The location was perfect. No marked trails, no cell service, and no chance of running into other people. It wasn't recklessness that drove me there, but a desire for solitude. The summer crowds had died down, and I was eager to enjoy the wilderness in its rawest form. I spent a week planning the trip. My backpack was loaded with everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, plenty of food, a water filter, a first aid kit, and a compact stove. I also carried a good knife and a flashlight with extra batteries. Even though I knew the area was teeming with wildlife, I wasn't particularly worried. Black bears were known to wander around, but encounters were rare if you followed the basic rules of camping. The drive to the forest was uneventful. The last stretch was a narrow, winding dirt road that seemed more like a forgotten logging trail than an actual path. When I finally reached the end, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense trees. I parked my car at the edge of the woods, shouldered my pack, and set off. My plan was to hike about 6 miles into the forest, far enough to ensure complete isolation but close enough to make it back to my car if something went wrong. The hike was challenging but invigorating. The terrain was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches, but the scenery was breathtaking. Tall pines towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of wildlife. A deer bounding gracefully through the underbrush, a squirrel chattering angrily from a high branch. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I found a small clearing near a creek. It was an ideal spot to set up camp. Flat ground, access to water, and enough space to pitch my tent without being completely exposed. The air was already cooling as I worked, the sun dipping below the horizon. By the time my tent was up and my gear organized, the forest had plunged into darkness. I cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky, savoring the warmth of the food against the chilly evening air. Sitting by the creek, I let the sounds of the forest wash over me. The gentle trickle of water, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But that peace didn't last. It started with a faint noise, something I couldn't quite place. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking of trees or the distant call of some nocturnal animal. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't natural. It was the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be another camper? Unlikely, given how remote this area was. A hunter? Maybe, but I hadn't seen any signs of human activity on my way in. My thoughts then turned to animals, but the rhythm of the steps was too deliberate, too human. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence so deep it felt oppressive. Then, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate crackling, this time closer. My hand instinctively went to my knife, but I didn't draw it. Instead, I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The darkness made it impossible to see anything beyond the faint outline of the trees. My flashlight was in the tent, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles. I didn't dare move. The sound stopped again, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For what felt like hours, I sat there, every nerve on edge. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, the shadows shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. My mind played tricks on me, turning every sound into a threat. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but the weight of the unknown pressed down on me like a physical force. Eventually, the sounds faded, and the forest returned to its natural rhythm. I didn't relax, though. Instead, I forced myself to move, crawling into my tent and zipping it shut. I didn't bother with my sleeping bag. Instead, I sat upright, knife in hand, listening for any hint of movement. The hours dragged by, each minute an eternity. I must have dozed off at some point because I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside. It wasn't subtle or distant. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Outside, the campsite was a mess. My cooking pot lay several feet from where I'd left it, and the contents of my backpack were scattered across the ground. There were no tracks, no signs of an animal or person. Just chaos. I didn't wait to find out more. I packed up what I could, leaving behind anything unnecessary. The idea of spending another second in that clearing was unbearable. With my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, I started the trek back to my car. The forest was a different beast at night. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified by the silence. I walked as quickly as I dared, my eyes darting around, my ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The trail I had followed earlier was harder to find in the dark, but I didn't care. My only goal was to put as much distance as possible between me and that clearing. Hours later, just as dawn began to break, I stumbled out of the woods and into the small clearing where I'd parked my car. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life a relief like no other. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the road and the nightmare I was leaving behind. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was an animal, curious and clumsy. Maybe it was another person, though the thought of someone stalking me in the middle of nowhere is almost too terrifying to consider. All I know is that I've never camped alone since. The wilderness is beautiful, but it has its own rules, its own dangers. That night, I learned just how small and vulnerable I really am. I don't usually go camping alone. It's something I've done a handful of times, but only when I feel confident about the location. This time, I had picked a place that was somewhat remote but still marked on the map. A narrow ridge about a 3-hour hike off a popular trail. The ridge was said to have amazing views, and although there were no campsites listed nearby, I figured I could find a flat enough spot to pitch my tent. I started early in the morning, parking my car at the main trailhead. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Felt good to be out there. I had packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, basic food, and water. I even brought a lightweight stove to make a hot meal once I got to my spot. The hike up was uneventful. The main trail was wide and well-maintained, and the markers were easy to follow. After about an hour, I reached the point where I had to branch off onto a narrower trail that led toward the ridge. This path was less maintained, with roots and rocks poking through the dirt, but it was still manageable. About 2 hours in, the trail began to climb steeply. I stopped a few times to catch my breath and take in the view as the trees thinned out. The ridge came into sight, a narrow strip of land jutting out with steep drop-offs on either side. It looked as breathtaking as I'd hoped, with the forest stretching out below like a green ocean. When I reached the ridge, I found a small flat area just wide enough for my tent. The spot was surrounded by low shrubs and a few scraggly trees clinging to the rocky soil. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. I set up my tent, took a few photos of the view, and sat down to eat a quick lunch. The wind picked up in the afternoon, howling through the trees and making the tent flap noisily. I decided to explore a bit, leaving my heavier gear behind. The ridge was narrow but walkable, and I followed it to its farthest point, where the land dropped off into a sheer cliff. Standing there, looking down at the valley below, I felt a mix of awe and unease. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to camp and started preparing dinner. The wind made it a bit challenging to get my stove going, but eventually, I had a warm meal. By the time I finished eating, the sky was a deep orange, and the first stars were appearing. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, but they were there, indentations in the dirt near the edge of the ridge, heading toward the direction I'd just come from. My first thought was that I'd somehow made them earlier without realizing it, but the size was wrong. These prints were larger than mine and deeper, like someone heavier had been walking there recently. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else had hiked out here earlier in the day, though I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. Still, the thought unsettled me. I scanned the ridge but saw no signs of anyone else. As the night fell, the wind grew colder, and the ridge seemed lonelier. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. The wind outside was relentless, and every now and then, it sounded like something was moving through the shrubs. I told myself it was just the wind, but my nerves were on edge. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. My heart raced. The sound was coming from the direction of the narrow trail leading to the ridge. I stayed as quiet as possible, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I reached for the small knife I kept in my backpack, gripping it tightly as I debated what to do. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My pulse was pounding in my ears. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity, but I couldn't hear any breathing or movement. Finally, the steps retreated, heading back toward the trail. I waited until I was sure the person, or whatever it was gone before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The ridge was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed huddled in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. The first light, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The peaceful solitude I had enjoyed the day before was gone, replaced by an overwhelming urge to leave. As I hiked back down the ridge, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I reached the main trail, I felt a wave of relief. There were other hikers nearby, and the presence of people made me feel safer. I hurried back to my car, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and that ridge. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I found the note. It was crumpled up at the bottom of my backpack, written on a scrap of paper in messy handwriting. "Don't come back. I don't know who left it or how they got into my backpack, but I haven't been camping alone since." I've always loved camping. The feeling of getting away from the noise of the world, the distractions of the city, and the constant buzz of notifications from my phone is something I've come to crave. For years, camping had been my go-to reset button, a way to disconnect and recharge. But after this trip, I don't think I'll ever step foot in the wilderness again. It started on a Friday in late September. The leaves had already started to turn golden, and the air carried that crispness that makes autumn my favorite season. I'd planned this trip weeks in advance, choosing a spot deep in the heart of the woods about an hour's drive from my house. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I'd stumbled upon a few years back during a solo hike. It was remote, quiet, and far enough off the beaten path that I could count on not seeing another soul for days. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, my camping stove, enough food and water for 3 days, a flashlight, a knife, a first aid kit, and my trusty hiking boots. I'd even brought a small notebook and pen to jot down thoughts or sketches while I was out there. The drive out was uneventful. The small dirt road that led to the trailhead was rough but manageable. I parked my car under a canopy of trees, locked it up, and strapped on my backpack. The hike to the clearing was about 4 miles, mostly uphill, but I'd done it a dozen times before. The familiarity of the trail was comforting, even as the towering trees and dense underbrush seemed to close in around me. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon. The sky was a mix of pinks and oranges, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, positioning it so that the entrance faced east, where the morning sun would rise. The process of setting up camp felt automatic. Pitch the tent, unroll the sleeping bag, arrange the cooking gear. It was a rhythm I'd perfected over years of camping. Dinner was a simple affair: a freeze-dried pasta dish rehydrated with boiling water. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you can only find far from civilization. The first night passed without incident. I woke up with the sun, the pale light filtering through the thin fabric of my tent. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I'd wandered these woods before, but there were still plenty of nooks and crannies I hadn't seen. With a small day pack and a bottle of water, I set off, leaving my campsite behind. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirped high in the canopy, squirrels darted between trees, and the occasional deer bounded away at the sound of my footsteps. I followed no particular path, just letting my curiosity guide me. Around midday, I stumbled upon a small stream. The water was clear and cold, and I paused to fill my bottle and splash some on my face. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a faint smell, something sour and metallic. I thought maybe it was a dead animal nearby, a deer or raccoon that had succumbed to the elements. But as I moved upstream, the smell grew stronger. It wasn't just decay. It was sharp, almost chemical, like rusted iron mixed with damp earth. Then I saw the first sign: a shoe partially buried in the mud near the edge of the stream. It was old and weathered, its laces frayed and its sole split. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and out of place. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to pick it up. Something about it unsettled me, so I left it where it was and continued upstream. The smell only got worse. About 20 yards from the shoe, I found what was left of a fire pit. Charred logs arranged in a crude circle, blackened rocks scattered around it. Nearby, there were scraps of fabric, faded and torn, tangled in the underbrush. And then there were the bones. At first, I thought they were from an animal. Small, bleached white, scattered across the ground. But as I looked closer, my stomach churned. These weren't animal bones. They were human. My first instinct was to turn back, to run as fast as I could back to my campsite, pack up, and get the hell out of there. But my legs felt rooted to the ground, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who had been here? What had happened to them? I forced myself to move, backing away slowly until I was a safe distance from the fire pit. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the forest. The once peaceful rustling of leaves now felt sinister, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I made my way back to the clearing as quickly as I could, every step fueled by a growing sense of unease. When I reached my campsite, I collapsed onto the ground, my mind still reeling. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the trees, trying to decide what to do. Leaving immediately seemed like the obvious choice, but the sun was already sinking lower in the sky. Hiking out in the dark would be dangerous, especially on an unmarked trail. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my knife within arm's reach and my ears tuned to every sound outside my tent. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the forest. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was faint, just the soft crunch of leaves, but it was enough to snap me awake. My hand closed around the handle of my knife, and I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart was racing, every muscle in my body tense. I considered shouting, trying to scare off whatever, or whoever, was out there, but fear kept me silent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the fabric of my tent. When I finally emerged, the clearing was empty. There were no signs of anyone or anything having been there during the night. But I didn't wait to find out if they'd come back. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to my car. The walk back felt much longer than 4 miles. Every sound, every shadow put me on edge. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and nearly shaking. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what I'd found. The rangers took me seriously, asking detailed questions about the location and what I'd seen. They assured me they would investigate, but I didn't stick around to find out what they discovered. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. The bones, the smell, the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what I encountered out there, but one thing is certain. I'm never going back to that clearing again. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys solitude. It's not that I don't like people. I do. But there's something peaceful about being alone in nature. I'd taken plenty of solo camping trips before, and nothing ever happened that made me second-guess my decision to go off on my own. That changed during one trip last summer. I decided to head out to a national forest a few hours from my home. It wasn't a particularly popular spot, which is exactly why I chose it. Most people went to the campsites closer to town with amenities like bathrooms and running water, but I wanted a more remote experience. I packed my gear, including enough food and water for a few days, and drove out to the trailhead early in the morning. The hike to the campsite I'd chosen wasn't too difficult, about 5 miles through dense forest. The trail was well marked, and though I didn't see another person, I could tell it was maintained regularly. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through the canopy. I reached the campsite by mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a fire ring made of stones someone had arranged long ago. A stream ran nearby, its gentle babbling providing a soothing background noise. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. After that, I gathered some wood for a fire and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, read a book by the light of my headlamp, and then crawled into my tent. The forest was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe and content. The next day, I decided to hike a bit farther into the forest. I'd seen a rough trail leading deeper into the woods, and curiosity got the better of me. I packed some snacks and water and followed the trail for a few hours. It was narrower than the main trail and clearly less used, but it was easy enough to follow. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out much of the sunlight. As the hours passed, I noticed an odd feeling creeping over me. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then I realized it was the absence of sound. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the breeze seemed to have stilled. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, and it made me uneasy. I decided it was time to head back. Turning around, I retraced my steps, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. Every so often, I stopped and looked over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling persisted. When I finally got back to my campsite, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling by busying myself with tasks, collecting more firewood, boiling water for dinner, but it lingered. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't fall asleep. Every little noise made me tense up, and I kept imagining someone, or something, lurking just beyond the light of my dying fire. The third day, I decided to cut my trip short. I couldn't explain it, but something about the forest felt off. It wasn't the peaceful retreat I'd hoped for. Instead, it felt oppressive, almost hostile. I packed up my gear and started hiking back to the trailhead. About halfway back, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been so clear on my way in, seemed different. Branches had fallen across it in places, and patches of undergrowth made it harder to follow. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I'd somehow taken a wrong turn. But when I checked my map and compass, they confirmed I was on the right path. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I started to hear noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. And though I told myself it was just the wind or animals, it didn't feel right. Then I saw it. A single boot print in the mud, larger than my own and clearly fresh. My heart raced as I stared at it. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived, and the thought that someone might be out here, silently following me, was terrifying. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The noises continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. The forest felt darker, the trees looming taller, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, pushed toward something or someone. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was setting. My car was the only one in the parking lot, just as it had been when I arrived. I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing. It wasn't until I was safely home that I allowed myself to relax. I unpacked my gear and tried to process what had happened. The boot print, the noises, the feeling of being watched. It could all have been a coincidence, my imagination running wild in the isolation of the forest. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That trip changed the way I think about camping. I still love the outdoors, but I'm more cautious now. I stick to well-traveled trails and avoid going alone. The forest is beautiful, but it's also vast and indifferent, and sometimes it's better to respect its mysteries than to try to understand them. I have always loved the wilderness. Something about the quiet solitude of a forest draws me in. No distractions, no phone buzzing, no deadlines. Just the whisper of leaves and the crackle of a fire. That's what I wanted when I planned a weekend trip to Blackwood Reserve. A vast, sprawling park about 3 hours from home. I had been there a few times before, but only for day hikes. This time, I wanted to challenge myself and spend 2 nights camping alone. It felt like the perfect opportunity to test my skills and disconnect from everything. I arrived mid-morning on a Friday, the air crisp and cool. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 other cars. That suited me just fine. I slung my pack over my shoulders, double-checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, emergency kit, and set off down the main trail. The hike to my planned campsite was about 6 miles. The first half of the trail was wide and well-maintained, winding through dense evergreens and the occasional clearing. I passed a few other hikers, exchanging polite nods, but I noticed how quickly the trail emptied as I got further from the entrance. By the time I reached the narrower, less trodden path leading to my campsite, I was completely alone. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt, the occasional bird call, and the faint rustle of animals in the underbrush made the whole experience feel alive. This was exactly what I came for. The spot I chose was perfect. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a slight slope that would keep water from pooling under my tent if it rained. A few large rocks formed a natural fire pit in the center, and a fallen log nearby made for a decent seat. I pitched my tent quickly, glad to get the chore out of the way. After arranging my sleeping bag and stowing my food in a bear-proof canister, I spent some time gathering firewood. By the time I was done, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in golden light. I started a fire and cooked a simple meal, just some instant noodles and jerky, but it tasted better than any restaurant food out here in the fresh air. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I felt a sense of calm. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like shards of glass, and the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. I woke up once in the middle of the night, disoriented. My watch read 2:13 a.m. The fire had died to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. I couldn't pinpoint what had woken me. There were no distinct noises, just an unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I listened for a while, holding my breath, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves. Telling myself it was probably just an animal passing through, I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was uneventful but enjoyable. I spent the morning exploring the area, venturing off-trail a bit to take in the untouched beauty of the forest. I saw deer grazing in a distant meadow and a hawk circling overhead. For lunch, I returned to my campsite and made a quick meal before deciding to hike a bit further up the trail. That's when I noticed it. About half a mile from my campsite, I stumbled upon something odd. A piece of cloth snagged on a bush. It was dark green and frayed, as if it had been there for a while. At first, I thought it might be from another camper, but it was strange. This part of the park was remote, and I hadn't seen a single person since yesterday. Curious, I looked around and found more signs. Boot prints in the soft earth, faint but unmistakable. They were too large to be mine, and they looked fresh, as if someone had walked this way recently. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard or seen anyone. Why would someone be wandering out here, away from the main trail? I told myself not to overthink it. Could be a ranger or another camper exploring the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I made my way back to camp. That night, the unease lingered. I double-checked my gear, making sure my knife was within reach and my food was secured far from my tent to avoid attracting animals. I even piled extra wood on the fire, hoping the flames would ward off whatever or whoever was out there. Sleep didn't come easily. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. At one point, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound in the distance. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, but it went on for what felt like hours. Tap, tap, tap. I finally fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sound that froze my blood. It was a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, just outside my tent. My heart pounded as I lay completely still, straining to hear. Another crunch followed, then another. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my knife, gripping it tightly as I tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing. It was close, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. My mind raced. Should I yell? Stay silent? Run? The breathing continued for a few agonizing moments before the footsteps resumed, moving away this time. I waited, listening until the forest was silent again. When dawn broke, I stepped out of my tent cautiously, knife still in hand. The fire had burned out completely, and the clearing looked undisturbed at first. Then I saw them, footprints. They circled my tent, the impressions deep and deliberate, as if someone had walked around it multiple times. I felt sick. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up camp in record time, adrenaline fueling my movements. As I hiked back to the main trail, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I reached the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. My car was untouched, and there were a few more vehicles than when I arrived. I quickly loaded my gear and started the engine, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and the forest. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, weeks later, the memory of those footprints and the sound of breathing haunts me. I still love the wilderness, but I haven't camped alone since that trip. Sometimes when I lie awake at night, I wonder who or what was out there in Blackwood Reserve, and more importantly, what they wanted. I've always loved camping. There's something about stepping away from the noise of life, the constant hum of technology, and just being out in the wild that feels refreshing. The air always seems fresher, the stars brighter, and the quiet more peaceful than anywhere else. That's what I thought, at least until my solo trip last October. Started off like any other trip. I'd planned to hike deep into the national forest near the foothills of the Rockies. The area wasn't too far from home, and I'd camped there a few times before. I knew the trails well and felt confident I could handle anything that came my way. The plan was simple: hike in about 8 miles, find a good clearing, and set up camp. I'd brought enough supplies for 4 days. Just me, the wilderness, and some time to reset my mind. The forecast predicted cool but dry weather, perfect for hiking. My pack was loaded with the usual: a small tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, a map, and other essentials. The trailhead was empty when I arrived, which didn't surprise me. It was midweek, and most people didn't have the time to get out here unless it was a holiday. I liked the solitude, though. I parked my car, locked it up, and strapped on my pack. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the kind where sunlight filters in just enough to make the leaves glow. The sound of birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels kept me company as I moved along. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the trees in shades of gold and amber. I decided to push on a bit further before setting up camp. There was a spot I remembered from a previous trip, a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, close to water and flat enough for my tent. It was another mile or so off the main trail, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be away from the beaten path, away from any chance of running into other hikers. When I arrived, it was just as I remembered. Secluded, quiet, and picturesque. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and built a small fire. Dinner was a simple meal of dehydrated food, but it tasted like a feast after the day's hike. The stream bubbled nearby, a soothing backdrop as I settled in for the evening. Night fell quickly in the woods. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the stillness, before crawling into my tent. The air was crisp, and my sleeping bag felt warm and cozy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. It was pitch black inside the tent, and the only sound was the gentle flow of the stream. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, just outside. I froze, my mind immediately racing through possibilities. Could have been a deer or maybe a raccoon. Animals weren't uncommon this far out, and they usually kept to themselves. Still, the sound put me on edge. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. The rustling grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random scuffle of an animal foraging. This sounded deliberate, like someone or something was moving carefully through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness like a knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. The beam of my flashlight swept across the trees, but I didn't see anything. The rustling had stopped. For a while, I sat there, flashlight in hand, listening. The night seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was nothing, just an animal passing through. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was up, the forest alive with sound, and everything felt normal again. I told myself not to let my imagination ruin the trip. After breakfast, I decided to explore a bit, following the stream upstream to see where it led. The hike was beautiful. The stream wound through the forest, its clear water glinting in the sunlight. I found some interesting rock formations and even spotted a few deer grazing in a meadow. By the time I returned to camp, it was late afternoon. That's when I noticed something strange. My campsite looked off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then I saw it. My tent had been moved. It wasn't where I'd pitched it the night before. It was only a few feet away, but the stakes had been pulled up, and the whole thing was slightly askew. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, searching for signs of anyone else, but the area was empty. Nothing else seemed disturbed. My food bag was still hanging from a tree, untouched, and my gear was where I'd left it. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe I hadn't secured the stakes properly, and the wind had shifted the tent. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The tent had been too secure, and there hadn't been any wind. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat by the fire, my eyes darting to the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my flashlight and a small knife within arm's reach. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke again to the sound of movement. This time it wasn't outside. It was inside the tent. My blood turned to ice as I realized the zipper of my tent was slowly being pulled open. I've always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. Camping was my way of escaping the daily grind, a chance to unwind and breathe the crisp, clean air far from the noise of the city. I'd camped dozens of times before, often solo, and I prided myself on being prepared and cautious. This trip was no different, or so I thought. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far off the beaten path. The area wasn't part of a designated camping ground, but I'd done my research. The forest was dense, crisscrossed by old logging roads long forgotten by most people. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, a portable stove, food for several days, plenty of water, and a reliable GPS device. I even carried a small first aid kit and a whistle just in case. I like to think of myself as cautious, but not paranoid. I parked my car at the end of a rough dirt road and hiked about 4 miles to the clearing I'd scouted online. It was perfect, a small grassy patch surrounded by tall pines, with a stream trickling nearby for water. The air was cool and fresh, with a faint pine scent that always reminded me of why I loved being out here. I pitched my tent, set up my stove, and started preparing for the evening. It felt good to be away from everything, with nothing but the sounds of the forest and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read a bit by the light of my headlamp, and fell asleep to the gentle sound of the stream. The only disturbance was a raccoon that sniffed around my campsite in the early hours, but it scurried off once it realized my food was stored in a bear canister. The next day, I explored the area. The forest was beautiful, untouched and wild. I followed the stream uphill, marveling at how clear and cold the water was. Occasionally, I'd spot deer tracks or hear the faint flutter of birds in the canopy above. I didn't see another soul all day, which was exactly what I wanted. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started to feel a subtle change in the atmosphere. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I brushed it off as my imagination, the product of being alone in an unfamiliar place. After all, I'd camped in remote areas before, and the isolation always brought a certain eeriness with it. After dinner, I decided to stargaze for a while. The sky was stunning, a tapestry of stars that seemed brighter than I'd ever seen. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a specific sound or sight that triggered it, just an instinctual sense that something wasn't right. I sat up, scanned the tree line with my flashlight, and saw nothing unusual. Telling myself it was just my nerves, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to faint noises, twigs snapping, the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was animals, maybe a deer or even a fox, but deep down I wasn't convinced. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, deliberate and slow, just outside the tent. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and after a long stretch of silence, I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the clearing, in the damp soil, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing boots, and these were barefoot, the toes clearly defined. They looked fresh, too, the edges sharp and unweathered. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at them. Who else would be out here walking around barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a hiker who'd wandered through, though it seemed unlikely given how remote the area was. Still, I decided to pack up and move to another spot. It wasn't worth taking chances. I loaded my gear, checked my GPS for a new location, and hiked about 2 miles deeper into the woods. The new site wasn't as picturesque, but it felt safer. There was a small ridge nearby that gave me a good view of the surrounding forest, and I set up my tent close to some thick brush for a bit of cover. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease, telling myself it was all in my head. By evening, I was feeling a little better. I cooked dinner, listened to the sounds of the forest, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But that night, the feeling of being watched returned. It was stronger this time, almost palpable. As I lay in my tent, I heard faint noises again, soft footfalls, the crunch of leaves. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my only real weapons, and waited. The noises stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again, farther away this time. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling my camp. I barely slept. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent and found more footprints. They were barefoot again, and this time they were closer to my tent. My heart raced as I scanned the forest, looking for any sign of movement. The forest was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to cut the trip short. It wasn't worth the risk. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to my car felt like the longest 4 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept imagining someone, or something, watching me from the shadows, just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I loaded my gear, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something dangerous. I don't know who left those footprints or why they were out there, but I've never gone camping alone since. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I think twice before answering. It's beautiful and peaceful, yes, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes it reminds you that you're not as alone as you think. I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. Life had been overwhelming lately, and the idea of disconnecting from everything for a few days felt like the best way to reset. I picked a spot in a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a popular camping area, which suited me perfectly. I wanted isolation, not a campground full of noisy people. The drive out there was peaceful, the road winding through dense forests and small towns that seemed untouched by time. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon, parked my car, and loaded up my gear. My backpack was heavier than I'd remembered from my last trip, but I didn't mind. I had everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit, and a small camping stove. The hike to the site I'd picked was about 5 miles. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through tall pines and patches of ferns. The air smelled earthy and clean, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt good to be out there, away from the noise of the city. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing near a small creek. It was perfect. The ground was flat, and there was plenty of space to set up my tent. The creek's gentle burbling added a soothing background noise. I dropped my pack, stretched out my aching shoulders, and got to work. Setting up camp was a routine I knew well. I pitched my tent under a large tree for shade, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and set up my cooking area a safe distance away. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some wood for a fire, even though I didn't plan to make one that night. It was more of a precaution in case the temperature dropped unexpectedly. After that, I cooked a simple meal on my stove, ate, and cleaned up thoroughly to avoid attracting any animals. As darkness fell, I settled into my tent with a book and my flashlight. The sounds of the forest at night were louder than I'd remembered. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. It was comforting, in a way, like the forest was alive and bustling with its own energy. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, feeling refreshed and eager to explore. After a quick breakfast, I followed the creek upstream. The terrain was rougher than I'd expected, with large rocks and fallen trees blocking my path, but it was worth it. I found a spot where the creek widened into a small pool, surrounded by moss-covered rocks. I spent the morning there, enjoying the solitude and the cool water. It wasn't until I started heading back to camp that I noticed something odd. There were footprints along the creek bank, fresh ones. They were larger than mine and pointed in the same direction I was heading. At first, I didn't think much of it. This was public land, after all, and it wasn't unreasonable to assume someone else might be out here. Still, I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I'd arrived, and the trailhead parking lot had been empty. Back at camp, everything was as I'd left it. I told myself I was overthinking the footprints. Maybe they'd been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. I busied myself with small tasks, collecting more wood, filtering water, and jotting down notes in my journal. As evening approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck whenever I turned away from the tree line. I told myself it was paranoia, a natural reaction to being alone in the wilderness. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every little noise outside my tent made me tense. I'd convinced myself that the forest was teeming with nocturnal creatures, each one more interested in my presence than the last. By morning, I felt drained but determined to stay for the full 3 days I'd planned. Day 3 started uneventfully. I stuck closer to camp, not feeling up for another long hike. By mid-afternoon, I'd begun to relax again, the unease from the previous night fading into the background. That's when I found the rope. It was thin, almost like twine, and tied between 2 trees just beyond the edge of my clearing. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. My stomach dropped. Someone had been in my camp. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no one in sight. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. I untied the rope and stuffed it into my pocket, unsure of what else to do. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. I kept expecting someone to step out of the trees, but no one came. By the time the sun set, I'd made up my mind to leave first thing in the morning. I barely slept that night, lying in my tent with my knife clutched in one hand. Every noise seemed amplified, each creak and snap sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still dark. Something wasn't right. My tent felt smaller, like the walls were closer than they should be. I unzipped the door and stepped out, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My heart stopped. The rope was back, tied between the same 2 trees. I didn't think. I grabbed my pack, threw it over one shoulder, and started down the trail. The forest was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness. My boots thudded against the ground, each step feeling heavier than the last. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, my breath loud in my ears. There was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the oppressive silence of the woods. By the time I reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack into the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow in the rearview mirror looked like a figure, every sound like footsteps. When I finally got home, I checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I haven't been camping alone since. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was a break I desperately needed, a chance to disconnect from everything and just be alone in nature. I had picked a quiet spot in the woods, far away from the usual crowded campsites. I figured it would be the perfect place for some peace and solitude. Little did I know, my decision to camp out in the wilderness would soon turn into something I wasn't prepared for. I set up camp by a small creek. The area seemed perfect, the sound of running water was calming, and the trees provided a natural shelter from the sun. As I unpacked my gear and set up the tent, I felt an eerie sense of calm. The kind of calm you get when you're in a place so remote, you almost start to feel like the world outside doesn't exist. I liked that feeling. The quiet of the woods was soothing, and I felt free from the usual chaos of life. As the afternoon passed, I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, aside from the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campsite. I wasn't worried. After all, I had camped before and I knew how to stay safe. But as the last light of the day disappeared, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest around me seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway, and I found myself looking around more than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone, but there was something off. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Night came quickly, and I settled into my tent, the warmth from the fire still drifting towards me. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard something, a soft, distant sound. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife moving around. This was something different, almost deliberate. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. It was too dark to see, but whatever it wasn't coming any closer. I tried to shake off the discomfort and lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I could still hear the occasional rustle, but it wasn't as frequent now. It was the kind of silence that makes you more aware of the small noises around you. And then there was a new sound, a thud, a heavy thud, like something large had just stepped on a branch, breaking it. I sat up quickly, my mind racing. This wasn't an animal. Something was out there. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight from beside my sleeping bag, my hands trembling. I was alone. I reminded myself of that. I was alone, and nothing could hurt me. But as I unzipped the tent, my flashlight flickered and then went out completely. Panic hit me like a wave. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard from miles away. I scrambled to get the flashlight working again, fumbling in the darkness, but all I could hear was my own breath, ragged and fast. Finally, I managed to get it back on, the beam weak but steady. I pointed it toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, staring into the shadows. I wanted to believe it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but something wasn't right. The stillness of the night was unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't go away. I stayed inside the tent for the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, listening to every sound, every movement. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, waking up several times to the same unsettling feeling. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge, but I convinced myself it was just the stress of being alone in the woods. I decided to pack up early and leave. I had been planning to stay another night, but the unease I felt was too much. As I gathered my things, I noticed something strange. The area around my campsite seemed disturbed. The ground had been scratched up, like something heavy had dragged its way through the trees. I stared at the marks for a while, trying to make sense of it. I didn't know what could have made them, but I didn't want to find out. I was just about to finish packing when I heard it again. A thud, followed by another. But this time it was closer, much closer. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed my bag and started walking quickly, trying not to break into a full run. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every step I took seemed to echo, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the trees. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, and panic surged. I was no longer walking, but running, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail back to the car seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. I didn't dare look back anymore. All I could do was run, my legs burning with effort. It was the longest, most terrifying trek I had ever made. Eventually, I made it back to the road, where my car was parked. I threw my bag into the trunk, barely able to control my shaking hands as I fumbled for the keys. I could still hear something, footsteps, slower now, coming from the woods behind me. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the trees. But I didn't wait to find out. I started the car and sped away, not looking back, not until I was miles down the road. The rest of the drive was a blur. My mind raced with questions. What had happened back there? Had I been imagining things? I didn't know, and part of me didn't want to know. I just wanted to get home, to feel safe again. I never went back to that campsite. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. But I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the wilderness isn't as peaceful as it seems. And sometimes it's better to leave the unknown exactly where it belongs, in the dark corners of the forest, where it's safest. I've been an outdoor enthusiast for as long as I can remember. Hiking, camping, fishing. There's something about nature that has always calmed me down, made me feel at peace. I used to take weekend trips with friends or solo treks into the wilderness when I needed time to clear my head. But that one weekend changed everything. It started like any other trip. I packed my backpack with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlights, and a first aid kit. Nothing fancy, just the essentials for a couple of days in the woods. I had chosen a remote location this time, somewhere far off the beaten path. There were no marked trails or campsites, the kind of place where the air feels thick and the trees seem to close in around you, almost like they're watching. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, so I didn't expect any surprises. I left early on a Friday morning, feeling the excitement build as I made my way out of town and into the forest. The drive was uneventful, just the usual winding mountain roads, the occasional deer darting across, and the silence that only a long stretch of forest can provide. When I reached the trailhead, the sun was still high, and the parking lot was empty. Felt like I was the only one there, which suited me just fine. The trail wasn't marked, but it wasn't hard to follow either. Just a few worn paths that looked like they had been walked on by the occasional hiker or animal. As I set off into the woods, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the distant calls of birds, and the rustling of branches in the wind. The temperature was perfect, not too hot and not too cold, and I felt like I could walk forever. Around midday, I found a small clearing by a creek. The water was crystal clear, and the rocks were smoothed by years of running water. I set up camp there, knowing I wouldn't find anything better. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. Just some dried pasta and canned vegetables. The fire crackled and popped as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. As night fell, the air grew cooler, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, watching the fire dance. There was something soothing about the flickering light in the dark, the way it pushed back the blackness and made the forest feel less imposing. I had planned to just relax and enjoy the solitude, but something about the night felt different. It was too quiet, if that makes sense. Not the usual hum of insects or the rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just silence. I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the isolation. I thought about reading a book or listening to music, but I didn't want to risk attracting unwanted attention by using my phone. It was supposed to be a time to disconnect, after all. The night wore on, and the silence only deepened. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers. The wind had died down completely, and the only sound was the soft gurgle of the creek. That's when I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint sound in the distance. A rustling. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a person, but I couldn't be sure. My instinct was to stay still, not make a sound, and wait to see if it would pass. But the rustling grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was walking through the woods, deliberately. Not the hurried steps of an animal, but the steady pace of a person. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just another hiker, lost in the night, making their way through the woods. But the more I listened, the more I realized something wasn't right. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. Whoever it was wasn't just passing through. They were coming closer. I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the clearing, the darkness too thick for even the faint light of the embers to cut through. I felt my heart beat faster in my chest. Every muscle in my body tensed, and for the first time I wished I had brought a weapon. But it was too late to regret that now. All I had was my flashlight, which I quickly grabbed from my pack. I turned it on, shining it towards the edge of the clearing. The beam cut through the dark, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, the footsteps continued, now closer than ever. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to make a decision. Should I confront whoever was out there? Or should I pack up and leave before things got any worse? I couldn't do either. If I packed up, they'd know I was leaving, and I'd be exposed. If I confronted them, it could escalate into something I couldn't handle. I sat there, frozen in my tent, listening. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Someone or something was definitely out there. They weren't just walking aimlessly. They were circling, moving around the clearing, trying to find a way in. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but everything seemed useless. I felt trapped, alone, and vulnerable. I reached for my knife just in case, though I didn't know how much use it would be in the dark, with someone who clearly knew the woods better than I did. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps ceased. The woods went silent again. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few minutes. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The flashlight beam cut through the trees, illuminating the clearing. But there was no one there. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the shadows. My senses were on high alert. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. But I saw nothing, heard nothing. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But the unease in my gut told me otherwise. I wasn't going to risk staying there any longer. I quickly packed up my gear, taking down the tent and stuffing everything into my bag as quickly as I could. It was still dark, and the woods felt even more oppressive now. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to head back to the car, even though I knew it would take me a few hours to get there. I couldn't stay there another minute. My legs felt heavy, my mind racing as I navigated through the dark forest, trying to remember the path back to the trailhead. I walked for what felt like forever, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But I made it back to the trailhead without incident, my car still sitting there, empty and quiet. I drove back to civilization, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the tension in my shoulders slowly easing as the trees gave way to the distant glow of the town. It wasn't until I got home that I realized just how shaken I had been. The next morning, I checked the news. There had been reports of a missing hiker in that area, someone who had gone off the trail and hadn't been seen since. They didn't find the body, but the search had been called off after a few days. They assumed the person had just gotten lost and had wandered too far off the trail. I never went back to that spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever or whatever had been following me, I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. Nature wasn't as peaceful as I once thought. The woods have secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left undiscovered. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape from the constant buzz of life. Just me, my tent, and the wild. I had planned it all out perfectly, a remote campsite in the woods, far from the usual crowds. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird calling out. A place where you could actually feel alone. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The air had that earthy smell, mixed with pine and damp leaves from a light rain earlier in the day. The kind of smell that makes you think of long walks and peace, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I set up camp near the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stand guard, their thick trunks and dense foliage blocking out most of the light. It was the perfect spot, isolated, peaceful, and quiet, the kind of place where you could almost hear your own thoughts. I was almost done with setting up my tent when I heard a snap, the kind of snap that comes from a branch being stepped on. I froze, listening intently, but all I heard after that was the usual sounds of nature. Birds, the wind, the rustling of leaves. I shrugged it off, assuming it was some animal, maybe a deer or something. Animals, after all, were a part of the deal when camping in the woods. As night began to fall, I lit a small fire, the flames flickering and crackling, casting dancing shadows on the ground around me. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air, and I relaxed, leaning back against a log, watching the fire. It was peaceful, too peaceful, but it felt right. The silence of the forest was a strange thing. I've always found it comforting at first, but the longer you sit with it, the more you start to notice the little things. The way the trees seem to sway just a little too rhythmically. The faintest whisper of movement just outside the firelight. The distant feeling of being watched. That's when I heard it again. A rustling in the bushes. Not an animal this time, but something deliberate. Slow. Cautious. I sat up straight, heart racing. I looked around, but all I could see were the dark silhouettes of the trees around me. The fire crackled louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, my hand trembling just a bit as I turned it on and scanned the area around my campsite. The beam of light swept across the clearing, then into the trees. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I decided to call it a night. There was no reason to get paranoid. It was probably just a branch or an animal moving through the underbrush. I got into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and tried to settle down. But sleep didn't come easy. The forest around me felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. It wasn't just the usual night sounds. It was something else. an almost oppressive stillness, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head, trying to shut it out, but the sounds outside the tent only seemed to grow louder. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Something or someone was out there. The feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't stop the panic from rising. I could feel the presence out there, just beyond the fabric of the tent. Something watching me, waiting. I lay still, listening. The rustling continued, but now it was closer, too close for comfort. I wanted to call out, but I was frozen, my breath shallow, not daring to move. The tent felt so small and vulnerable. The silence around me stretched, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, in the distance, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. It wasn't human, not quite. It was a high-pitched, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep in the woods. I don't know how long I lay there, not moving, but the scream didn't come again. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but the only sound was my own breath, quick and panicked. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had almost gone out, leaving only glowing embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I scanned the area around me, but there was nothing, no movement, no signs of anything out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't about to stick around in the middle of the night, alone in the woods with whatever that thing was out there. I didn't care how much I had planned this trip. The woods weren't worth it. But as I was gathering my gear, I heard the rustling again. It was so close this time that it sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. It was fast, too fast for a deer. It moved like something with intent. My heart skipped a beat, and I bolted toward the trail, not looking back. The whole forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot mixing with the pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop until I was on the trail, far from the clearing. The rustling had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't know what it was or who or what was out there, but I wasn't waiting to find out. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the bushes, sent a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination running wild or if there really was something following me, but I didn't want to find out. When I finally saw the lights of my car, relief washed over me like a wave. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into the trunk, jumped into the car, and drove off without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, driving through familiar towns and roads, the lights of civilization offering me a sense of safety. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't have the words. How do you explain that kind of fear? That feeling of being hunted, like something was waiting for you in the dark? I've been camping since, but I'll never forget that night. The woods hold a certain kind of magic, I guess, but it's not always the good kind. Sometimes, it's the kind that watches you from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. But here's the thing, nothing ever happened to me. There was no monster, no supernatural being, no paranormal event. It was just the forest, and maybe the fact that it's always alive, even when we don't realize it. It's always watching, always waiting. And in the end, I think that's what scared me the most. I still go camping, but I always make sure to stay near the edges of the woods, near the roads where the light's always close by. You never know what might be hiding just out of sight, just beyond the trees. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, the quiet peace of nature, the thrill of being far from everything. So, when my friends and I planned a camping trip deep into the woods, I was excited. We picked a spot away from the usual campgrounds, far enough that we wouldn't hear the noise from nearby tourists. I had no idea then that I'd be running for my life before the trip was over. The first day was perfect. The sun was high, the air was crisp, and we set up our tents near a small, quiet stream. Everything was calm and normal. We spent the day hiking, laughing, and just enjoying the solitude of the forest. It was a typical camping trip. No one had any concerns, and the night sky lit up with stars once we gathered around the campfire. We cooked dinner, shared stories, and just felt the warmth of the fire against the chill in the air. But things started to feel different as night fell. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the forest around us. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses against you and makes you feel like you're being watched. First, I brushed it off as nerves. It was just the woods. It was just the darkness. But that night, when I lay in my tent, I kept hearing noises. Faint at first, just the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. It was probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer, maybe a fox. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to ignore the sound. But then came a loud rustling, like someone, was moving through the underbrush just outside the camp. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. I got up and zipped open the tent slowly, careful not to make a sound. My flashlight cut through the darkness in front of me. The camp was quiet now, the fire long burned down to embers. But the forest felt alive in a way that wasn't natural. I couldn't see anything at first, just shadows shifting in the trees. I waited for a few minutes, hoping whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. There was something out there. I could feel it. I decided to wake up the others, but just as I was about to move toward the other tents, a sharp, loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by a deep, unsettling growl. My stomach dropped. The growl was too low to be any kind of animal I knew, definitely not a bear, not a wolf. It was something much deeper, much more menacing. I froze. The others didn't stir, but I wasn't going to wait to find out what was out there. I quickly zipped my tent back up and lay flat, my heart racing. The noises came again, this time closer. The rustling in the underbrush, the snapping of branches. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination. But then, through the silence, I heard it. Faint voice. It was distant, and I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering if I was just overreacting. But by the time morning came, the sun rising weakly over the trees, I knew something wasn't right. The others were still sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We packed up our things, eager to move to a different location. But as we were getting ready to leave, we noticed something strange. There were tracks in the mud near our tents, human-like tracks, but they were large, almost as if whoever left them had been walking barefoot through the forest. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling in my gut, but I couldn't. I urged everyone to hurry. It didn't take long before we were packed up and back on the trail, walking quickly but quietly, trying to make our way out of the area. But the feeling didn't go away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we walked deeper into the forest, we realized that the trail we were following seemed unfamiliar. The trees looked different. The path wasn't as clear as it had been the day before. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. We were lost. Panic began to set in. We checked our maps, retraced our steps, but nothing seemed right. The forest felt too dense now, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. It was getting late again, and we had no choice but to set up camp. We found a small clearing and decided to make the best of it. But as night fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. We all tried to brush it off, but none of us could shake the unease. Then came the sounds, the rustling, the snapping of branches. But this time it was too close, too loud to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight again, scanning the area, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Suddenly, a scream shattered the air. One of my friends bolted upright from his tent, eyes wide with fear. We heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps rushing through the brush. There was no time to think. We grabbed our stuff and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Through the trees, over rocks, scrambling through the underbrush like we were being hunted. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified. We didn't stop to ask questions, just made our way back to the nearest road. We flagged down a passing car and got back to civilization. None of us spoke much on the way out, too shaken by what we'd felt, what we'd heard. Looking back now, I know what we experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods, something that didn't want us there. The woods were always a second home to me. I grew up camping, fishing, and hiking with my dad, who had an almost spiritual connection to nature. So, when I decided to spend a solo weekend in the mountains, I wasn't nervous. In fact, I was excited. I wanted to unplug, clear my head, and reconnect with the wild. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the trees, and the stars. I chose a remote area about 3 hours from the nearest town. The trailhead was at the end of a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense pine forests. I parked my truck in a small clearing, packed up my gear, and started the hike. The air was crisp, the sky was cloudless, and the sound of birdsong filled the silence. It was perfect. The hike took me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the sunlight barely touched the ground. I walked for about 6 miles until I found a flat spot near a small, bubbling creek. It was an ideal campsite, close to water, shaded by towering pines, and far enough from the trail to feel truly alone. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, just some beans and rice from a pouch. The warmth of the flames and the soft crackle of burning would make the forest feel less intimidating. Still, the silence out here was different. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, something vast and unyielding. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring at the glowing embers and thinking about how disconnected life in the city felt. Out here, time stretched. Hours felt like days. There was no rush, no deadlines, no notifications. It was freeing but also unsettling. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, secured my food in a bear-proof bag, and hoisted it into a tree a safe distance from my tent. Inside the tent, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and lay on my back, listening to the faint hum of the creek. Sleep came slowly. I woke up to the sound of something snapping outside. My eyes opened instantly, my body tense. It was pitch black. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, I heard it again, a distinct crack of a branch breaking underfoot. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? Maybe a raccoon? But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a long pause and then another sound, closer this time. I cursed myself for not bringing a gun. I had a hunting knife and bear spray, but they suddenly felt inadequate. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness and landed on the tent wall. The sounds outside stopped immediately. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening. Then, Just as I was starting to think it might have been an animal passing through, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper. My blood ran cold. Someone was unzipping the flap of my tent. Before I could react, the tent collapsed around me. The poles snapped, and the fabric pressed down on my face. I thrashed wildly, trying to fight my way out, but whoever was outside was pulling the tent down with force. I screamed, not caring who or what heard me. Finally, I managed to cut through the fabric with my knife and crawled out, gasping for air. The fire pit provided just enough light to make out the shape of a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and holding something in his hand, something long and blunt. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I bolted into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Branches slapped my face, and roots threatened to trip me with every step. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath. I turned off the flashlight, crouching low behind a fallen tree. The forest was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps. He was following me. I waited, trying to control my breathing. When the footsteps grew louder, I knew I had to move. I turned the flashlight on for a split second to get my bearings and saw a rocky slope ahead. I scrambled up it, hoping the uneven terrain would slow him down. At the top, I found a cluster of boulders and squeezed into a narrow gap between them. It was a tight fit, but I felt hidden. I turned off the flashlight again and waited, clutching the knife so tightly my hand ached. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't dare move. My body was shaking, not from the cold but from adrenaline. I stayed there until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally emerged, the forest looked different. Less menacing but still eerie in its silence. I made my way back toward the campsite, sticking close to the creek to avoid getting lost. When I reached the site, my stomach dropped. The tent was shredded, my gear was scattered, and my food bag was gone. The fire pit had been kicked over, leaving a mess of ash and soot. Whoever it was, they had been thorough. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed what little I could salvage and started the hike back to my truck. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking flight, a squirrel rustling in the underbrush. Everything felt like a threat. When I finally reached the parking lot, my truck was untouched, but there were fresh boot prints in the dirt nearby. Someone had been there recently. I drove straight to the nearest town and reported what had happened. The local sheriff listened, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. "Probably some drifter," he said. "You're lucky he didn't do worse." I left feeling frustrated and shaken. The woods, once my sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger. I haven't been camping alone since. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. Some places are wild for a reason, and not all threats in the forest come from nature. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town, I spent my childhood exploring the woods behind my house, learning the sounds of the forest, and feeling at home under the canopy of trees. As I got older, camping became my way of reconnecting with that part of myself. It gave me peace, clarity, and a sense of accomplishment. But what happened on my last solo camping trip shattered that comfort and changed how I see the wilderness forever. This particular trip was meant to be a challenge. I'd been planning it for weeks, for days alone in a remote stretch of national forest, far from the usual campsites and hiking trails. The area wasn't completely untouched, but it wasn't heavily trafficked either. It was rugged and wild, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, triple-checking my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit, a sturdy knife, and a headlamp with extra batteries. I even brought a GPS device in case I got turned around. I thought I was prepared for anything. The hike to my planned campsite was about 8 miles from where I parked my car. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived early that morning. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, took a deep breath of cool mountain air, and started walking. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense pine forest, the ground covered in a thick layer of needles that muffled my footsteps. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. As the day wore on and the trail grew steeper, the forest started to thin out. The trees became scraggly and wind-beaten, and the ground turned rocky. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge where I planned to set up camp. The view was breathtaking. The forest stretched out below me, a sea of green rolling into the distance. To the west, I could just make out the glint of a distant river. I found a flat spot to pitch my tent, not too close to the edge, but with a clear view of the valley. It was perfect. After setting up camp, I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. I followed a narrow game trail down the ridge to a small stream, where I refilled my water bottles and washed off the sweat and dust from the hike. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I made my way back to camp. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove, just dehydrated soup and some instant coffee, and sat on a rock to watch the sunset. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, then faded to deep blue as the first stars appeared. I felt completely at peace. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, lulled by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The next day, I spent my time exploring the surrounding forest. I ventured further from camp, marking my path with small cairns of stones to ensure I could find my way back. I found another stream, some interesting rock formations, and even a patch of wildflowers that seemed out of place in the otherwise harsh terrain. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already low in the sky. I ate another simple meal, watched the stars for a while, and crawled into my tent. It was the second night when things started to feel off that I woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie stillness. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the occasional rustling in the underbrush were absent. At first, I thought I'd just woken up naturally and that the silence was nothing to worry about. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, I realized something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air that made my skin prickle. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I wasn't used to the quiet, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it was there. My heart started to race. I lay completely still, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't steady, like the rhythm of an animal walking. It was irregular, stopping and starting, as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to move quietly. I reached for my knife, which I'd placed next to me before going to sleep, and gripped it tightly. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A bear? Another person? I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and this area wasn't popular with hikers. The thought of someone else being out here, sneaking around in the middle of the night, sent a chill down my spine. The footsteps continued, circling my campsite. They never came too close, but they didn't go away either. I lay there for what felt like hours, clutching my knife and listening. Eventually, the sound faded, and the forest was silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found no sign of anyone or anything around my camp. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I told myself it must have been an animal, though I couldn't think of any that would behave like that. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I spent the morning gathering firewood and the afternoon reading a book I'd brought. By evening, I felt a little more relaxed. I built a fire, hoping the light and warmth would help me feel more secure. It did, at least for a while. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They didn't circle my camp like before. Instead, they approached directly, stopping just beyond the edge of the firelight. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I held my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, but I didn't dare turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. The footsteps stopped, and for a long time, there was silence. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural breathing. It was slow and heavy, like someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching me. I gripped my knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to run, but where would I go? The forest was vast and dark, and I didn't know what was out there. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my camp and started hiking back to the trailhead. My pack felt heavier than ever, and every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. I threw my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. I've thought about it endlessly, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know that someone or something was out there in the woods with me. And whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. That trip changed how I feel about camping. I still love the outdoors, but I'm no longer as comfortable being alone in the wilderness. Now, I always go with friends, and I stick to more populated areas. The forest is beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. And sometimes it's better not to be alone. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, where nature feels like a constant companion, the outdoors always felt like home to me. There's something about sitting under a canopy of stars, hearing the rustle of trees, and breathing in the cool, pine-scented air that quiets my mind. After moving to Switzerland, I found the Alps equally mesmerizing. It's different, but the call of the wild feels the same. When I planned a solo camping trip in late autumn, I wasn't seeking adventure. I just wanted peace, a break from work and the steady hum of city life. I picked a spot that wasn't too remote, a clearing near a narrow hiking trail I'd taken before, about a 4-hour walk from the nearest village. The map showed a stream nearby, and the area looked secluded but not too isolated. It was mid-November, and I knew the weather could turn quickly, but I packed well, layers of clothing, a good tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, and enough food to last 3 days. I was prepared, or so I thought. The hike in was beautiful. The trail wound through dense woods, the kind where sunlight filters through in shifting patterns, and you can almost feel the trees breathing. There was no one else on the trail that day, which suited me fine. Occasionally, I heard the faint crunch of animals moving through the underbrush, but nothing out of the ordinary. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow stream gurgling a little way off. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without a hitch, and I gathered enough dry wood for a fire later. As the sun began to dip below the treetops, the air grew colder. I pulled on an extra jacket, lit the fire, and made dinner, a simple meal of instant noodles and tea. The woods were quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the branches. The quiet was comforting at first, like a soft blanket wrapping around me. But as the evening wore on, that comfort began to fray. It's hard to pinpoint when it started. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to pause now and then, leaving a silence so deep it felt heavy. Or the subtle shift in the rustling sounds, like something moving closer. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the woods at night. It's natural to feel a little on edge. Still, I decided to keep the fire going. Its flickering light felt like a barrier against the darkness pressing in. I sat there, staring into the flames, letting the warmth seep into my bones. Hours passed. The fire crackled, and my nerves settled slightly. I was tired but reluctant to crawl into my tent just yet. The night felt too vast, too alive. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A faint, deliberate sound. A crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, this time closer. My heart started to pound. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the steps were too slow, too deliberate. Not the quick, skittering movements of a curious critter. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The crunching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the forest had gone still again. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The fire was still burning strong, and I was probably just overthinking things. I went into my tent, leaving the fire smoldering outside. My sleeping bag was warm, and exhaustion eventually overpowered my unease. I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up abruptly in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark outside, but something had jolted me awake. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it again, a soft, scraping sound, like something brushing against the nylon of my tent. I froze, every muscle tensed. The sound moved around the tent, slow and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? But it didn't sound like claws or a snout sniffing around. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. Flicking on the light, I aimed it at the tent walls, hoping to scare off whatever was outside. The sound stopped instantly. The silence was deafening. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees, and the familiar sounds of the forest waking up began to fill the air. The fear that had gripped me all night started to loosen its hold. When I finally stepped out of the tent, the clearing looked untouched. No signs of anything unusual. I told myself it must have been an animal, that I'd overreacted. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to cut my trip short. Packing up quickly, I headed back to the trail. The hike out felt different. The woods, so welcoming the day before, now seemed oppressive. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, though I saw no one. About halfway back to the village, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the trail was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly, deliberately. It hadn't been there on my way in. I was sure of it. My mind raced. Was it a coincidence? Had someone else passed through here? I didn't stop to think about it for long. Quickening my pace, I pushed forward, not stopping until I reached the village. The relief I felt stepping onto the paved road was almost overwhelming. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and the dark. Or maybe someone or something was out there in the woods with me. All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since. I didn't expect the hike to be easy, but I also didn't expect it to test every ounce of my patience and endurance. It was early October, and I had set out on a solo camping trip in a remote area of the Adirondacks. I'd spent months planning this, poring over maps, checking gear, and making sure I was physically prepared. I'd done solo trips before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. The area I chose wasn't a popular spot, and I liked it that way. No crowded trails, no sounds of other people. Just me and nature. The drive out took almost 5 hours. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The trail was narrow, barely marked, and wound through a maze of tall pines and thick undergrowth. My destination was a clearing about 7 miles in, where I planned to set up camp near a small lake. It was the kind of spot you'd see on a postcard, calm water reflecting the surrounding trees, with a view of distant peaks. The first few miles were uneventful. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was heavy in the cool breeze. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted through the underbrush, and once, I spotted a deer standing motionless in the distance, its ears twitching. I kept a steady pace, stopping only briefly to adjust my pack or sip water. The trail was more rugged than I anticipated, with steep inclines and patches of loose rocks, but I felt strong and determined. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker. I'd brought a headlamp, but I didn't want to use it yet. There was something about walking in the fading light that felt more immersive, more connected to the environment. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was a deep orange, fading into indigo. The lake was just as beautiful as I imagined. The water was still, except for the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface. The surrounding trees were a mix of green and fiery autumn colors, their reflections shimmering in the fading light. I wasted no time setting up camp. My tent was a compact one-person model, lightweight and easy to pitch. Once it was up, I gathered some wood for a small fire. The forest floor was littered with dry twigs and branches, so it didn't take long. By the time I had a fire going, the sky was completely dark, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I cooked a simple meal, a freeze-dried pasta dish, and ate it slowly, savoring the warmth. The fire crackled softly, and the glow of the flames created a comforting bubble of light in the otherwise pitch-black night. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bare canister away from the tent, I settled in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted but content. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. I drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the sounds of the wilderness. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. My heart was pounding, and I lay still, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the fabric. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed completely still, listening. It could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but something about the sound unsettled me. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to be in a hurry. The rustling would stop for a few moments, then start again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly. When I turned it on, the beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting shadows that danced with every movement. I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I listened, hoping the sound would move away, but it didn't. It grew closer until it was just outside my tent. My breathing was shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then silence. Whatever was out there had stopped moving. I gripped the flashlight tightly, debating whether to call out or make a noise to scare it off. Before I could decide, I heard a new sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the ground. It was faint but distinct, and it sent a chill down my spine. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The firelight had all but disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the moon. The forest was a maze of shadows, and at first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, about 20 feet away, I spotted movement. A dark figure was crouched low to the ground, partially obscured by the trees. It was too far to make out details, but it was definitely human. My first thought was to call out, but something stopped me. The figure wasn't moving like someone lost or looking for help. They were methodical, deliberate. They appeared to be dragging something. A long, heavy object that I couldn't identify in the low light. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't seem to notice me. They moved slowly, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? And what were they dragging? I considered packing up and leaving, but the thought of walking through the dark forest with that person, or whoever else might be out there, was terrifying. Instead, I stayed in the tent, clutching my flashlight and bear spray, and waited for dawn. When the first light of morning crept through the trees, I finally felt a sense of relief. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area carefully. There was no sign of the figure or whatever they had been dragging. The forest was calm, almost eerily so. I decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. As I dismantled the tent, I noticed something odd. About 10 feet from my campsite, the ground was disturbed. The dirt was scuffed, and there were drag marks leading into the woods, the same direction the figure had gone. My stomach churned, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The hike back was grueling. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to keep moving, resisting the urge to run. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I threw my gear in the trunk and sped away, not looking back. Later, when I told a friend about the trip, they suggested it might have been a poacher or someone burying illegal traps. Maybe that was true, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't just someone minding their own business. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, and I'm not sure I want to. That trip was my last solo hike. Something about the experience changed the way I see the wilderness. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also vast and indifferent. You never really know who or what you might encounter out there. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, nature was a constant companion, and weekends often meant hikes in the forest or nights spent under a canopy of stars. When I moved to Switzerland, I discovered that the mountains here offered a beauty that was just as captivating. One weekend in late September, I decided to camp solo near a less-traveled trail deep in the Jura Mountains. It was the off-season for most hikers, and I wanted solitude. The drive to the trailhead took me through winding roads flanked by dense forests and occasional clearings with postcard-perfect views of the valley below. I parked at a small gravel lot where only one other car sat, a dusty station wagon that looked like it hadn't moved in days. I took a moment to adjust my pack, double-checking the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a first aid kit. The weather forecast was clear, with temperatures dipping just below freezing at night. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in some spots, proof that this wasn't a popular route. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned, revealing glimpses of jagged cliffs and rolling hills in the distance. By late afternoon, I reached a small plateau with a perfect view of the surrounding mountains. The spot was flat, sheltered by a cluster of pines, and offered just enough space for my tent. I set up camp quickly, taking care to position the tent away from a slight dip in the ground where rain might pool, even though the sky was clear. After unpacking, I boiled water for a simple meal of instant noodles and tea. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Wrapped in my jacket, I sat outside the tent, enjoying the silence and the occasional crackle of branches in the fire I'd built. By the time darkness fully enveloped the campsite, the fire was dying down. I crawled into my tent, zipping myself snugly into my sleeping bag. The forest at night was a symphony of sounds: distant owl calls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, and the whisper of wind through the trees. It was soothing, and I drifted off quickly. I woke abruptly. My phone's screen read 2:17 a.m. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up during the night while camping, but something felt off. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Gone were the soothing night sounds, replaced by a stillness that felt oppressive. I lay there, straining to hear anything. A branch snapping, a gust of wind, but there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. The sound came from somewhere to my left, near the edge of the campsite. My heart pounded as I held my breath, listening. The steps were deliberate, moving closer and then pausing, as if whoever or whatever was out there was surveying the area. I stayed still, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing the tent. My mind raced with possibilities. Could be another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost and stumbled upon my camp. But the deliberate pauses between the footsteps felt calculated, almost predatory. The sound stopped altogether, and the silence stretched on. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look, but fear kept me frozen. Minutes passed, then a full hour, and I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a fitful sleep. Morning brought a sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the familiar sounds of the forest returned. I stepped outside, scanning the area. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed faint footprints in the dirt, circling the tent. They were too large to be from an animal, and the way they meandered around the campsite sent a chill down my spine. I decided to pack up and head back to the car. The feeling of unease lingered, but I convinced myself it was probably just another camper who had wandered too close and left without realizing I was there. The hike back was uneventful, but when I reached the trailhead, I stopped in my tracks. The station wagon was gone, replaced by a different car, a dark SUV with tinted windows. It wasn't unusual for hikers to come and go, but something about this vehicle felt out of place. It was spotless, as if it had been washed recently, and the windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. Shrugging off the feeling, I loaded my gear into my car and started the drive home. The narrow roads wound through the forest, and the bright morning sunlight made everything feel less ominous. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The dark SUV was following me. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence, but as the kilometers ticked by, it stayed behind me, keeping a steady distance. I decided to test my theory. At the next junction, I turned onto a smaller road that led to a nearby village. The SUV followed. My pulse quickened. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I knew I needed to find a safe place to stop. The road eventually led to a small gas station. I pulled in, parking near the entrance. The SUV slowed as it approached but didn't stop. Instead, it continued down the road and disappeared around a bend. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and went inside the station to grab a coffee. When I returned to my car, a piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was scrawled in jagged handwriting. Next time, don't camp alone. I looked around, but the gas station was empty except for the clerk inside. There was no sign of the SUV or anyone else nearby. Heart pounding, I got into my car and drove straight home, glancing nervously at my mirrors the entire way. That was the last time I camped alone. Even now, months later, the memory of that night lingers. I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were, but the warning was clear. Sometimes, solitude in the wilderness isn't worth the risk. I've always loved the wilderness. Growing up, my father would take me camping every summer, teaching me how to pitch a tent, start a fire, and read the land. He used to say, "Respect nature, and it will respect you." Over the years, I learned how to navigate trails, spot signs of wildlife, and handle myself in the woods. These skills became second nature, and I grew confident in my ability to handle the great outdoors. But no amount of experience could have prepared me for what happened on my solo camping trip last year. It was late September, just as the leaves were starting to change. I had taken a week off from work to escape the monotony of my 9 to 5. I wanted to go somewhere remote, somewhere I wouldn't see another soul for days. After some research, I settled on a national forest about a 6-hour drive from my home. The trail I chose was lightly trafficked and led to a secluded lake surrounded by dense woods. It was perfect. I packed my gear meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, knife, first aid kit. Everything was accounted for. I even brought a small emergency beacon just in case. My friends teased me for being overly cautious, but I didn't care. It was better to be prepared than to regret it later. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though the last hour was spent on a bumpy dirt road that twisted through thick forest. When I finally arrived, there was only one other car parked at the trailhead, a dusty sedan with an out-of-state license plate. I felt a small pang of relief. I liked the idea of being alone, but knowing someone else was out here made me feel a little safer. I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was heavy in the air. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The first few miles were peaceful, almost meditative. I felt the stress of work and city life melt away with each step. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached the lake. It was breathtaking. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky. I found a small clearing near the shore and set up my tent. After gathering some firewood, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of rice and canned chicken. As I ate, I watched the stars emerge, one by one, until the sky was a sea of glittering lights. That first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the lake. I spent the morning exploring the area, fishing, and taking photos. It was exactly the escape I had hoped for. Things started to feel off on the second night. It began with the feeling of being watched. I had just finished dinner and was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest around me was dark, the kind of dark that swallows everything beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching me. I told myself it was nothing. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, becomes amplified, feeding your imagination. I tried to ignore it and focus on the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I finally crawled into my tent, I couldn't relax. My ears were tuned to every sound outside. The occasional breeze rustling the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. These were normal. But then I heard something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow and deliberate, not the erratic scurrying of an animal. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down I didn't believe it. My heart was pounding as I gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. They led from the woods to the edge of my campsite and then back into the trees. My stomach churned as I stared at them. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I debated packing up and leaving, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to let fear ruin my trip. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket. That day, I stayed close to camp. I didn't wander far, keeping my knife and bear spray within arm's reach at all times. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest, once peaceful and inviting, now felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. As night fell, my anxiety grew. I built a larger fire than usual, hoping the light would deter anyone or anything from coming too close. I sat with my back to the lake, where I could see the entire campsite and the surrounding woods. My knife was in my lap, and the bear spray was clipped to my belt. The hours dragged by. The fire crackled, and the forest was eerily quiet. I was just starting to think I might be overreacting when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of firelight. I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering glow of the flames, but I could feel someone, or something, standing there, watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I stood up, trying to appear confident, even though my legs felt like jelly. "I'm armed," I said, hoping to scare them off. Still, there was no response. Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they retreated. The sound of crunching leaves grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared altogether. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I started packing my gear. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another night. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the other side of the clearing, where the woods began, there was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there the day before. Someone had placed it there during the night. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without running. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest felt alive, like it was closing in around me. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like a person. When I finally saw my car, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I practically threw my gear into the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, they were gone. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a prankster trying to scare me. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never gone camping alone since. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. You can prepare for almost anything, but you can't prepare for the unknown. That trip reminded me of something my father used to say: respect nature, but never forget that it doesn't owe you safety. I don't think he was just talking about the weather or wild animals. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't nature, it's other people. I've always loved the woods. There's something calming about being surrounded by tall trees, the earthy smell of moss, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It's where I go when I need to escape the noise of everyday life. This time, I planned a solo camping trip, a weekend off the grid to reset my mind and get back to basics. I'd done solo trips before, but this one felt different. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the heavy gray clouds that seemed to linger on the horizon or the nagging feeling I had while packing. The drive out to the forest took a little over 3 hours. I chose a spot far away from the popular camping areas. My destination was a dense part of the forest I'd found on a map, near a small, nameless creek. There were no official trails leading there, just faint paths left by other adventurers. That's what I liked about it. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. I parked my car on the shoulder of a narrow dirt road, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional chirping of birds or the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The air was damp and cool, and the further I walked, the thicker the trees became. It took about an hour and a half to reach the spot I'd picked out on the map, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with the creek flowing gently nearby. After setting up my tent and gathering enough wood for a fire, I settled in. The first evening passed uneventfully. I cooked a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest as darkness crept in. The distant hoot of an owl and the babbling creek made for a peaceful soundtrack. Eventually, I crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The next morning was calm, though overcast. I spent the day exploring the area, following the creek upstream and collecting bits of kindling as I walked. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost hypnotic. The rustling leaves, the occasional scamper of a squirrel, the distant knock of a woodpecker. I lost track of time and returned to my campsite just as the gray sky began to darken. That second night was when things started to feel off. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire when I heard a strange noise. Something between a rustle and a snap, like someone stepping on dry twigs. It came from the direction of the creek, maybe 20 or 30 yards away. I froze, straining to hear over the crackling of the fire. The sound didn't come again. It's probably just an animal, I told myself. Deer, raccoons, and even black bears were common in this area. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it toward the creek. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I decided to let the fire burn down and call it a night. As I lay in my tent, I kept replaying that sound in my mind. It was probably just an animal, I thought again, trying to reassure myself. But then why did it feel like I was being watched? I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up suddenly. The forest was silent, too silent. The usual hum of insects and the babbling of the creek were gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to make sense of the unease that gripped me. Then I heard it again, the same snapping sound, this time closer. My heart pounded as I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. The faint moonlight barely illuminated the clearing, but I could see my campsite was undisturbed. The fire had died out, leaving only a few glowing embers. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the direction of the sound. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. My stomach clenched, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I couldn't be sure, though. It might have just been my imagination or a trick of the light. I crawled back into the tent, zipped it up tightly, and gripped the handle of my camp knife. Sleep was out of the question, so I lay there, listening to every creak, rustle, and snap outside. The hours dragged on, and eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I considered packing up and heading home, but part of me felt silly for being scared. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I just spooked myself in the dark. I spent most of the day staying close to camp. I kept my knife within reach and built the fire earlier than usual, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. That night was worse. The sounds started again, but this time they didn't stop. The snapping of branches and rustling of leaves seemed to come from all directions. It wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough to keep my nerves on edge. I felt trapped, surrounded by an invisible presence I couldn't pinpoint. Then, around midnight, I heard a sound that sent chills down my spine. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't a bear. I'd heard bears before. This was different, more primal, and it was close. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. My hand trembled as I swept the beam back and forth. Then I saw it just for a split second. A figure, human-like but wrong, standing at the edge of the clearing. It moved too quickly for me to get a good look, disappearing into the shadows before I could fully register what I'd seen. Panic set in. I couldn't stay here another night. I quickly packed my essentials, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. With my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, I began the hike back to my car. The journey through the forest at night was terrifying. Every sound made me jump, and I constantly felt like I was being followed. I moved as quickly as I could, my flashlight barely lighting the uneven path ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me as I sprinted the last few yards, throwing my gear into the back seat and jumping behind the wheel. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. The road was empty, but the fear lingered. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. I've thought about it 100 times, trying to rationalize what I saw and heard. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Either way, I haven't been back to the forest since. Some places I've learned are better left unexplored. I'd been camping before, but this time felt different. The plan was simple. 3 nights alone in the Pine Hollow Forest, a vast stretch of trees in the middle of nowhere. I wanted solitude. Life had been wearing me thin, and I craved the quiet. No phone, no emails, no noise except for the wind rustling through the trees. I packed light but smart. My old but reliable tent, a sleeping bag rated for freezing temperatures, a portable stove, canned food, a first aid kit, a knife, and a small flashlight with extra batteries. I also had a map and compass. This wasn't my first solo trip, and I wasn't careless. I parked my car at the trailhead just after sunrise. The crisp morning air felt good, invigorating. The forest was alive but calm. Chirping birds, distant rustles of unseen animals, and the crunch of my boots on the trail. The trail itself was easy to follow at first, winding between towering pines that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. After about 3 hours of hiking, I veered off the marked path. I wanted to be away from everything. I knew the risks, getting lost, encountering wildlife, but I also knew how to navigate. I marked trees with a small strip of biodegradable tape as I went. My destination was a clearing I'd seen on the map, a flat spot near a small stream. Took another hour to reach it, but it was perfect. The clearing was surrounded by thick trees, and the stream gurgled softly nearby. I set up my tent quickly and gathered wood for a fire. The day passed quietly, just as I'd hoped. I read for a while, cooked a simple meal of soup and bread, and stared into the flames as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night came fast, and with it, a chill. I climbed into my sleeping bag, feeling content. The first night was uneventful. I woke to the sound of birds and the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent walls. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I kept the stream as my landmark, following it as it twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt endless, the trees so dense they blocked out much of the sunlight. It was easy to lose track of time, and before I knew it, the sun was high overhead. I turned back, following the stream to my campsite, or at least I thought I was. Something felt off. The trees looked different. The stream forked unexpectedly, and I wasn't sure which branch to follow. I pulled out my map and compass, but the landmarks didn't match. Panic started to creep in, but I forced it down. I retraced my steps, walking carefully, but the more I walked, the more lost I felt. The afternoon slipped away as I wandered, trying to find the clearing. I rationed my water, knowing I'd need it later if I didn't find the stream again. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer. I hadn't seen another person all day. Not surprising, given how remote this area was, but the isolation now felt oppressive. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, put me on edge. By the time I stumbled upon my tent, it was nearly dark. Relief washed over me, but it was brief. Something wasn't right. The fire pit had been disturbed, the rocks scattered. My gear was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been here. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon maybe. I rebuilt the fire pit and lit a small fire, keeping it low to conserve wood. Dinner was quick, and I climbed into my tent early, knife close at hand. Sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside made my heart race. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke abruptly, my tent shaking. For a moment, I thought it was the wind, but the shaking was too deliberate, too rhythmic. My heart pounded as I held my breath, listening. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out with my flashlight. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, I found footprints near my tent. Human footprints. They weren't mine, they were too large. They led from the edge of the clearing to my fire pit, then back into the trees. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but I hesitated. Could have been a hiker, someone curious. But why wouldn't they say something? I spent the day close to camp, uneasy but determined not to let fear ruin my trip. I collected more wood, explored the clearing, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. The footprints were old, I decided, probably from days ago. That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could. I sat by it, knife in my lap, listening to the forest. The sounds of the woods were normal crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. But as the hours passed, I began to hear something else. Faint, rhythmic tapping, like wood on wood. It came from deeper in the forest, too far to see but close enough to hear. I stayed up all night, the fire burning low. The tapping continued, steady, relentless. When dawn finally came, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up quickly, dousing the fire and double-checking my gear. I tried to follow the tape I'd left marking my way in, but some of it was gone, torn away. The trail I'd made seemed to vanish into the trees. I relied on my compass, heading in what I thought was the direction of the trailhead. The forest seemed different now. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my throat dry. The sun was high when I finally stumbled onto the marked trail. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A noise stopped me in my tracks. Footsteps, close but just out of sight. I froze, heart racing. They were deliberate, heavy, and getting closer. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran, not caring about the noise I made, just wanting to put as much distance as I could between me and the sound. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I threw my gear into the trunk and sped away, the forest disappearing in my rearview mirror. It's been weeks, but the experience hasn't left me. I still hear the tapping sometimes when I close my eyes. I still wonder who or what was out there with me. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. It started as a peaceful solo camping trip, something I'd done many times before to escape the city noise. The plan was simple: spend 3 nights in the wilderness, hike a few trails, and enjoy the quiet. I chose a spot deep in a forest reserve, known for its dense woods and secluded beauty. This wasn't a commercial campsite with picnic tables and nearby parking. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. The hike in was exhausting but rewarding. I followed a narrow trail winding through towering pines and oaks. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream. The spot was perfect: flat ground for my tent, fresh water nearby, and plenty of firewood scattered around. I set up my tent carefully, ensuring it was secure against the wind. After that, I collected enough wood to last the night and built a fire pit with stones from the stream. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned stew and bread. The flames crackled, and the woods around me darkened into an almost impenetrable blackness. The night was still except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. By 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. The fire was reduced to glowing embers, and the forest was silent. Inside the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I felt at ease. The solitude was comforting, a reminder of how disconnected I often felt in the city. But that calm didn't last. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. It wasn't uncommon for me to wake briefly during a camping trip, but this time felt different. My senses were on high alert, my heart pounding for no apparent reason. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear something, anything, outside the tent. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It wasn't constant, more like intermittent steps, slow and deliberate. The sound was close, too close for comfort. My mind raced with possibilities: a deer, maybe a bear, or even a person. I didn't dare move or make a noise. The footsteps circled my campsite, stopping occasionally before resuming. Minutes felt like hours as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag. The sound eventually faded, but I couldn't relax. Every noise seemed amplified in the silence: the rustle of leaves, the creak of tree branches, even the distant babble of the stream. I barely slept the rest of the night, and when dawn finally broke, I was relieved to step outside and find no sign of anything unusual. The second day started uneventfully. I decided to hike a trail leading deeper into the woods, hoping the exercise would calm my nerves. The forest was beautiful, with shafts of sunlight piercing through the canopy and birds flitting between branches. But even in daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd stop and look around, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease lingered. When I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. A small stack of rocks had appeared near my tent. It wasn't there when I left, and I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. The rocks were neatly balanced, forming a crude tower about a foot high. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As night fell, I tried to distract myself with another campfire and a hot meal. I kept my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach, just in case. The fire gave me a sense of security, but the woods felt different now, more oppressive. The usual nighttime sounds seemed distant, as if the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder and more deliberate. They stopped and started, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel a presence out there, watching me. My heart raced, and I gripped the knife tightly, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. It came from the direction of the stream, and my blood ran cold. I stood up slowly, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows and foliage. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey being stalked. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until it died down, clutching the knife and listening to the forest. When dawn finally arrived, I decided to pack up and leave. The trip was supposed to last 3 days, but I couldn't take another night like that. As I dismantled my tent, I found something that made my stomach churn. Another stack of rocks had appeared, this time right outside the tent. It was smaller than the first, but its meaning was clear. Someone or something had been at my campsite while I was inside the tent. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest felt alive, not with the usual sounds of nature, but with an unsettling awareness. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run, my heart pounding the entire way. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I've heard stories of hermits and survivalists living off the grid, but the deliberate nature of the rock stacks and the way they circled my campsite felt more menacing than accidental. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I'm not sure I ever will. That trip was a stark reminder that the woods can hold secrets we're not meant to uncover. It was late autumn when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip deep in the woods. The idea had been brewing for weeks, a chance to disconnect from the noise of daily life and immerse myself in the quiet solitude of nature. I'd always found peace in the wilderness, and with winter creeping closer, this felt like the perfect time to escape. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and a few other essentials. My pack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The weight was a reminder of self-reliance, something I appreciated more each time I ventured out alone. I chose a location off the beaten path, a secluded spot I'd found on a hiking forum. It wasn't marked on any maps, but the directions seemed straightforward. Follow the main trail for 3 miles, veer off at a rocky outcrop, and hike another mile until you reach a small clearing by a stream. The weather was perfect when I started out. The air was crisp but not too cold, and the sky was a soft, endless blue. The forest was alive with the colors of fall, reds, oranges, and yellows mixed with the ever-present greens of pine and spruce. The ground was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves, and the occasional crunch underfoot broke the otherwise serene silence. The first part of the hike was easy, the main trail well-trodden and wide. I passed a couple of other hikers early on, exchanged brief nods, and then found myself alone. The further I walked, the quieter it got. By the time I reached the rocky outcrop, it felt like I'd left the rest of the world behind. I paused for a moment to adjust my pack and take a sip of water, then turned off the main path and began the final stretch toward my campsite. This part of the hike was more challenging. The terrain was uneven, the trail non-existent. I had to rely on the directions and my compass, navigating around fallen trees and patches of dense undergrowth. I kept an eye on the sun, noting its position in the sky. It was still early afternoon, but the forest was growing darker as the canopy thickened overhead. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted the clearing. It was just as described, a small, flat patch of ground nestled beside a narrow stream. The sound of flowing water was soothing, and the spot felt utterly remote. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on the driest patch of ground I could find and securing it against the slight breeze that had picked up. The stream provided clear, cold water, and I used my portable filter to refill my bottles. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some dry wood for a fire and built a small ring of stones to contain it. As the flames grew, the warmth and light were comforting against the encroaching darkness. Dinner was simple, instant noodles and a protein bar, but satisfying after the long hike. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, though the animals were likely more afraid of me than I was of them. Or so I told myself. As the night deepened, the firelight seemed to shrink against the vast darkness of the woods. I could see the stars through gaps in the trees, brighter than I'd ever seen them back home. The temperature dropped quickly, and I eventually retreated into my tent. Snug in my sleeping bag, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what I'd come for, the simplicity, the quiet, the connection to something bigger than myself. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to an unfamiliar sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the soft gurgle of the stream, but it grew louder as I focused on it. It was a steady, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart began to race. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The sound stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then it started again, closer this time. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving slowly, almost cautiously. I reached for the flashlight I'd left by my side and turned it on, shining the beam toward the tent's entrance. The zipper was still closed, but I could see shadows moving outside, faint and distorted against the fabric. I froze, my mind racing. Should I call out? Stay silent? The footsteps stopped again, right outside the tent. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I didn't dare move. After what felt like an eternity, the shadows shifted, and the sound of footsteps resumed, moving away this time. I waited until the sound faded completely before daring to unzip the tent. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I shone the flashlight around, scanning the edges of the trees, but saw nothing unusual. The leaves were disturbed near the tent, as if someone or something had been walking there, but there were no clear footprints. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of navigating the woods in the dark was even more terrifying. Instead, I stoked the fire back to life, determined to stay awake until morning. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge, but nothing else happened. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I quickly packed up my gear, eager to leave the clearing behind. The hike back to the main trail felt longer than it had the day before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I never saw or heard anything to confirm it. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car, a surge of relief washed over me. I tossed my pack into the trunk and climbed in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't help but replay the night's events in my mind. I'll never know who or what was outside my tent that night. Maybe it was another hiker, curious about my campfire. Maybe it was someone with less innocent intentions. Or maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by the isolation and darkness of the woods. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The woods had a way of reminding you just how small and vulnerable you really are. And as much as I loved the wilderness, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel entirely safe camping alone again. Camping in the woods had always been my way of finding peace. Growing up in a small town surrounded by endless forests, I had learned early on how to navigate trails, read a map, and start a fire without much fuss. Solitude, to me, was not loneliness, it was freedom. This particular trip was meant to be no different. The plan was simple: spend 3 nights in the woods, far from the city, and closer to nature. I chose a spot deep within a national park, well away from the marked campsites. The area had been known for its quiet beauty, tall pines, and wide open skies at night. I wanted isolation, and I got it. I parked my car near the edge of the forest, packed up my gear: a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and the usual essentials, and began my hike. The trail started easy, wide and well-trodden, but as I ventured deeper, it narrowed and the trees thickened. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky orange and pink, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect to set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, their needles forming a soft carpet on the forest floor. A small stream ran nearby, the sound of trickling water adding to the serene atmosphere. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked a quick meal. The night crept in, and with it came the chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Under the blanket of stars, I felt entirely at ease. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, the golden light of dawn filtering through the trees. After breakfast, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I kept my compass and map handy, marking my path mentally as I wandered deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely touches the ground, but there was an eerie kind of beauty in it. The scent of pine and damp earth was intoxicating. About 2 hours into my exploration, I stumbled upon something odd. A rope hung from a tree, frayed and weathered, as if it had been there for years. Nearby, the remains of a campfire lay in a small circle of stones, but it wasn't recent. The ash was long gone, leaving only blackened logs and a few bits of trash. A rusted can, a faded wrapper. Something about the sight felt off, but I brushed it aside. People camped here before, I thought. Nothing unusual about that. I continued on, pushing the unease to the back of my mind. The day wore on, and I kept track of the time. By late afternoon, I made my way back to my camp. As I approached, I noticed something strange. My tent, which I had left zipped up, was slightly open. My first thought was animals, maybe a curious raccoon had wandered in. But as I checked my belongings, everything seemed untouched. The zipper itself didn't look damaged, and there were no signs of animal tracks or any disturbances. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed up later than usual, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, set my nerves on edge. I eventually fell asleep, but it was restless, full of half-formed dreams about the rope and the old campfire. The second day was colder. A heavy cloud cover rolled in, and the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I decided to stay closer to camp, chopping wood and preparing for what looked like rain. Around midday, as I was gathering water from the stream, I saw footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, and they led from the edge of the stream back toward my camp. My heart raced as I followed them, each step heavier than the last. When I reached my tent, the footprints vanished. They didn't lead away. They stopped, as if the person had simply disappeared. I checked my belongings again. Everything was still there, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe someone had wandered by and decided not to disturb me. Maybe the footprints weren't as fresh as I thought. But no matter how I rationalized it, the unease lingered. That night, the rain started. It wasn't heavy, just a steady drizzle that soaked the ground and made the air feel colder. I stayed in my tent, listening to the patter of rain on the nylon above me. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. The sound was deliberate. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, a soft scraping sound began, like someone dragging a stick along the side of the tent. It moved in a slow circle, stopping occasionally before continuing. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, but I didn't dare move or make a sound. The scraping stopped abruptly. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours before I finally fell into a light, uneasy sleep. When morning came, the rain had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. I unzipped my tent cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place, no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. But when I looked closely at my tent, I saw faint marks where the scraping had been, lines etched into the fabric. I decided then and there to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to my car felt like it took twice as long as the hike in. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. When I finally reached the parking area, my car was untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. The relief I felt as the forest receded in my rearview mirror was indescribable. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've told myself it was nothing. A trick of the mind, my imagination running wild in the isolation. But the marks on my tent, the footprints, the deliberate way those sounds circled me, they weren't imagined. I haven't been camping since. The cold air rushed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I had always enjoyed the solitude of the forest, especially when the world outside felt too chaotic. But something about this trip felt different. I had been out camping dozens of times before, but this time, things weren't adding up. I was alone. I knew I had to be cautious, but I trusted my instincts. The woods I was in were far from any marked trail, and I'd come here often, knowing the rough terrain well. But as I set up my tent, there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. The forest was eerily quiet, even for a remote place like this. There was no chatter from the usual wildlife, no distant calls of birds or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the wind, whispering softly through the canopy above. As the sun began to set, the wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that made me reach for my jacket. The sky, which had been clear and bright earlier, was now clouded, the fading daylight obscured by thick gray clouds. It was strange for this time of year. I come prepared for cold nights, but not like this. I started a fire to keep warm. The crackling of the flames was a small comfort in the vast emptiness around me. My eyes flickered to the surrounding trees. Their dark, looming shapes almost seemed to lean in toward me, as if they were watching, waiting for something. Night fell, and the darkness seemed to press in. My fire burned steadily, but the shadows around it seemed deeper than they should have been. The wind picked up again, and that's when I noticed something strange. A low whisper, faint but undeniable, cut through the night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't feel right. It was almost as if it had a rhythm, a pattern, like something was trying to speak. I leaned forward, straining to hear. The whisper stopped. The silence returned, but only for a moment. Then it came again, louder this time, but still incomprehensible. I stood up, my heart pounding now, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Was it an animal? No, the sound didn't match anything I knew. The whispers were too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and moved cautiously toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there, just the dense forest. I turned around and walked back to the fire, my mind racing. Maybe I was just being paranoid, or maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But as I sat back down, the whispers came again. This time it sounded closer. My skin prickled with unease. Was someone out there? Was someone messing with me? I wasn't far from the nearest road, but the woods were thick, and no one had passed by in hours. I was certain of that. I thought of calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The battery was low, and it would be hours before I could even think about getting back to civilization. No one would find me out here. The wind began to howl, louder than before, and the whispers turned into murmurs. They seemed to float around me, coming from all directions, but never clear enough to understand. My stomach turned in knots, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't, at least not yet. My car was parked a good distance away, and I wasn't about to hike back through the dark without knowing what was really going on. For what felt like hours, I sat there, staring into the fire and listening to the unsettling whispers. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal I hadn't noticed before. But the more I listened, the more I realized the sound wasn't natural. It didn't follow any kind of pattern that I recognized. Then suddenly the whispers stopped. Dead silence. The only sound was the wind, but it was no longer as strong as before. The forest felt different now, still almost too still. It was as if the air itself had thickened. A shiver ran down my spine. That's when I saw it, movement between the trees. Just a flicker, a shadow that darted too quickly to be anything normal. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes were locked on the spot where I had seen it, but when I shined the flashlight there, nothing was visible. I checked every direction, heart pounding, feeling the hairs on my neck stand on end. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, or maybe the wind moving the branches? But then I saw it again, a shadow, unmistakably human in shape, moving across the trees, just outside the reach of my flashlight. I froze. Panic began to rise in my chest. My mind raced. Was someone out there, stalking me? No, that couldn't be. The whispering, the shadows, it was all too much to be a coincidence. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing what I could inside. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I needed to get out of there, away from whatever was out there with me. The fire was still burning, but I didn't feel safe. The shadows in the woods were closing in. I couldn't stay here. I picked up my tent and tore it from the ground. With shaking hands, I started to pack it up as quickly as I could. My mind was swirling with thoughts. Could it be someone camping nearby? Or was it something else? Just as I was finishing up, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. A branch snapped, not far away. Close. I dropped everything, bolting for the path. My feet were heavy, my breath coming in short gasps. The flashlight was still in my hand, but it was useless now. The beam barely cut through the thick blackness of the forest. Every tree seemed to have a shadow, a figure in the corner of my eye. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? But when I finally made it back to my car, I was gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably. My hands fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence was deafening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the woods through the windshield. The wind had died down, and the darkness seemed to be swallowing everything around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there, watching. But as the minutes passed, I realized I wasn't going to see whatever it was again. The whispers had stopped. The shadows in the trees had faded into the night. The forest was still, and I was safe for now. I started the engine, and the car roared to life. I didn't look back as I drove down the winding path that led me out of the woods. The trees blurred past, and my pulse slowly began to steady. As I reached the main road, the tension in my body eased. The city lights were a welcome sight, far removed from the eerie quiet of the woods. I didn't know what I had experienced out there. Whether it was just my imagination or something more, I may never know. But one thing was certain: I would never camp in those woods again. It had been a long time since I'd gone camping. The kind of camping that involves setting up a tent, cooking over an open flame, and really getting into the wilderness. Most of the time I went on trips with friends, but this time I was on my own. I figured a solo adventure in the woods would be a good way to clear my head and get some peace. I had no particular place in mind, just a spot I'd picked on the map a couple of weeks ago when I had some free time. It seemed like the perfect escape from the stress of everyday life. I set off early in the morning, the air crisp with the promise of a good hike ahead. The woods I had chosen weren't too far from where I lived, but they were remote enough that I wouldn't have to deal with crowds. The kind of place where the only sounds would be birds, wind through the trees, and maybe the occasional squirrel rustling in the underbrush. Just the kind of peaceful escape I needed. The trail was easy to follow at first, just a narrow path winding through the dense trees. It was beautiful, almost too quiet. As I walked, I noticed the usual sounds of wildlife, but they felt muffled, as if the woods were holding their breath. The trees were tall and dense, with thick branches reaching out to each other, creating a natural roof that blocked out most of the sky. I could feel the cool shade filtering through the leaves, the ground soft beneath my boots. I kept walking for a few hours, stopping here and there to take in the scenery or drink some water. The trail had some ups and downs, but nothing too strenuous. The kind of hike where you could get lost in your thoughts and just appreciate being away from everything. Around noon, I came across a small clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp. The sun was still high, and I figured I had a few hours before dark. I decided to take my time, set up my tent, and cook something on the camp stove. There were no other campers around, and I was relieved by the solitude. Felt like the woods were mine alone. I found a good spot near a small stream that ran through the clearing. It wasn't a roaring river, just a gentle flow of water that sounded soothing. The air smelled fresh, damp, with a slight earthiness that I knew would linger with me for days. I set up my tent first, making sure everything was secure. I'd done this plenty of times before, so it didn't take long. The stove was next. I started boiling some water to make a quick meal, sitting down on a large rock nearby while I waited. I had brought simple food with me, nothing fancy, just some dehydrated meals and snacks. I wasn't planning on staying out long, just a night or two, so I didn't need much. It felt good to just sit there in the quiet, the gentle sound of the stream mixing with the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I could feel myself starting to relax, the weight of the world slowly lifting from my shoulders. I ate my lunch, enjoying the peace that came with being alone in the woods. After eating, I decided to explore a little. The trail had a fork in it not far from the clearing, and I was curious to see where it went. It didn't look like anyone had been down that path for a while. The brush was thick and the ground was soft, with barely any footprints to show for it. I figured it would be a good little adventure. The path led me deeper into the woods. It was more overgrown than I expected, the trees closer together, blocking out even more of the light. The air felt heavier here, and the silence was more intense, as if everything was holding its breath, watching me. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but it was hard to ignore. The further I walked, the more the woods felt strange, like they were alive in a way that made me uncomfortable. I didn't turn back, though. I wasn't one to back down from a challenge. So I kept going, trying to push the unease to the back of my mind. The path twisted and turned, winding around trees and rocks. I had no idea how far I had gone, but the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. It was getting late. When I finally decided to turn around and head back to my camp, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look the same as it had when I first walked down it. It was like the trees and rocks had shifted, or maybe I had just lost my bearings. But the path ahead didn't feel right. I couldn't see the clearing I'd come from, and everything looked unfamiliar. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I checked my watch. It was getting late, and I needed to get back to camp before dark. The sun was nearly gone, the sky a dusky purple, and the forest seemed to grow darker by the second. I started walking faster, trying to retrace my steps, but the woods felt different. The trees closed in tighter, the branches creaking above me like they were whispering secrets. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I had just been down this path a little while ago. But something was off. My heart started racing. It wasn't just the changing light. It was something about the woods themselves. The air had a sharpness to it, and the sounds had stopped. The birds, the wind, they were all gone. It was dead quiet. I kept walking, my steps quicker now, but every time I thought I saw something familiar, the trees and rocks seemed to shift again. My mind was playing tricks on me. I had to be imagining things. But then I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking. It was loud, too loud, cutting through the silence like a shout. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal, it was too deliberate, too human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, but the darkness was thick now, and I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of my flashlight. My hand trembled as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees, but there was nothing there. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. My mind was racing. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear. But that snap, it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I snapped myself out of it. No, I wasn't going to let fear take over. I had to get back to my camp, to the safety of the tent and the fire. So I forced myself to move again. Faster now, my legs pumping with urgency. The path ahead was darker, and I couldn't see the familiar landmarks anymore. Another snap, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat again, and I broke into a run. I had to get back, had to make it back to camp. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I didn't stop running, not until I saw the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. My chest was tight, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled back into the clearing. The fire was still burning strong, a small comfort in the vast, quiet woods. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I approached the tent, the familiar sight of my gear offering some sense of security. I quickly packed up, no longer caring about the mess or the time it would take. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave now. The woods were not friendly, and whatever was lurking in the darkness was not something I wanted to face. My heart was still pounding as I grabbed my things and hurriedly packed them into my bag. The sun had set completely, and the night was thick around me. The firelight flickered and danced in the corner of my vision, a comforting presence as I worked. By the time I finished packing, the woods felt suffocating, like the trees were closing in around me. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my backpack, hoisted it over my shoulders, and started heading back to the trailhead, my flashlight bouncing with each step. The path felt longer on the way back, every rustling of the leaves making me jump. But eventually, I reached the trailhead, and I didn't stop until I was back at my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, but once I was inside, I locked the doors and took a deep breath. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the dark woods in front of me, my pulse finally starting to slow. I drove away as quickly as I could, the headlights cutting through the darkness, leaving the woods behind. I didn't know what had happened out there, or what had been watching me, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was all just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet, that had made me paranoid. But deep down, I knew that whatever I felt in those woods, it wasn't just my imagination. Something had been out there, and I would never know exactly what it was. But I was glad I didn't have to find out. The forest had always been my refuge. Growing up in a small town, surrounded by endless stretches of pines, the woods were my escape. But when you're older, the same places that once felt comforting can feel a lot less forgiving. I hadn't been camping alone in years, and I figured it was time to rediscover that part of myself. The plan was simple: drive up to the state forest, hike 5 miles into the backcountry, and spend 2 nights in complete solitude. No phone service, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I left on a Friday morning in late September, the kind of crisp fall day that makes you feel alive. My car was loaded with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, a map, and my trusty compass. I parked at a trailhead where the asphalt met the dirt and shouldered my pack, eager to disappear into the trees. The hike in was uneventful. The trail was well marked, winding through a dense forest of pine and oak, with the occasional clearing that offered glimpses of distant ridges. I passed a couple of other hikers on their way out, exchanged polite nods, and kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a spot that felt just right. A flat area near a small creek with plenty of firewood and enough open sky to see the stars at night. Setting up camp was second nature. The tent went up quickly, the fire pit was easy to arrange, and soon I was boiling water for a dehydrated meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I sat by the fire, sipping instant coffee and staring into the flames. The isolation was perfect, but as the hours passed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, a kind of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I chalked it up to nerves. It had been years since I'd camped solo, and my imagination was probably just running wild. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to let the sound of the creek lull me to sleep. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Took a moment to realize what had startled me. There was a sound outside, something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the gentle rustle of wind or the scampering of a small animal. This was deliberate, heavy. I lay still, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Every muscle in my body tensed. Could be a deer, I told myself, or maybe a bear. But deep down, I knew better. The cadence was unmistakable, 2 feet, not 4. Someone was out there. I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag, my fingers trembling. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. The footsteps circled my campsite, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves and twigs. Then they stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I clutched the knife tightly, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek outside. The campfire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of an intruder. I convinced myself it had to be an animal and climbed back into the tent, though I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I surveyed the campsite more thoroughly. I found tracks in the dirt, boot prints, unmistakably human. They circled the perimeter of my camp before disappearing back into the woods. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been watching me. I considered packing up and heading back to the car, but my pride got the better of me. I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my trip. Instead, I decided to stay vigilant. I spent the day exploring the area, making sure to keep my bearings. The forest was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, gathering firewood and preparing for another night. I built the fire bigger this time, hoping the light and smoke would deter any unwanted visitors. As the sun set, the forest grew eerily quiet again. I sat by the fire, knife within reach, and tried to focus on the soothing crackle of the flames. Hours passed without incident, and I began to think maybe I'd scared off whoever or whatever had been lurking the night before. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, loud and deliberate, just beyond the firelight. I froze, every sense on high alert. The sound came again, closer this time. I stood, gripping the knife tightly, and called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. No response. The footsteps started again, slow and methodical, circling just outside the glow of the fire. I could barely make out a shape moving between the trees, a dark figure, staying just out of reach. Panic set in. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out like a torch, the flames casting flickering shadows across the forest. "I'm armed," I shouted, hoping to sound more confident than I felt. The figure stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, clutching the knife and the makeshift torch, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time packing up my gear. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods behind me were empty. It wasn't until I reached the car that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I tossed my pack into the trunk, started the engine, and drove away, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down the dirt road. When I got home, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the trip in my mind. Who had been out there? What did they want? I reported the incident to the park rangers, but there wasn't much they could do. The forest was vast, and without more information, tracking down the person or people responsible was nearly impossible. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it stayed with me. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt tainted. I haven't been camping alone since. I've been camping in the woods before. I've slept under the stars, sat around campfires with friends, and hiked through thick forests without a second thought. But that night, alone, deep in the woods, it was different. I had decided on a solo trip, just to get away from everything. No distractions, no noise, just me, the trees, and the calm sounds of nature. It had started out as the perfect plan. I'd set up camp by a small stream, the kind you can hear trickling softly through the rocks. There was a clearing where I pitched my tent, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to go on forever. I was far enough from the trail that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed by other campers, but close enough to the stream that the sound of water would keep me company. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finished setting up. I decided to go for a short walk, to get my bearings and take in the view before dark fully settled in. As I wandered further from the camp, the forest grew denser, and the light seemed to fade quicker. The trees here were taller, their trunks thick with age, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I didn't think anything of it at first, but there was a quiet tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, reminding myself that it was just the woods. After all, I'd been in forests like this before. But when I turned back to head to camp, the path seemed less clear. The trees had shifted, or maybe it was just my perception. It was hard to tell. I figured I must have wandered off the trail, so I tried retracing my steps, but each direction looked the same. The faint sound of the stream was still there, but it didn't feel as close as it should. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I'd read somewhere that it's easy to get disoriented in the woods, especially when the sun's setting. I wasn't panicking yet, but I did quicken my pace. I had a map and a compass, both of which I usually trusted, but that night they seemed off. I checked my phone, though I wasn't expecting service, and sure enough, there was nothing. That didn't help calm my nerves. After what felt like an hour of walking in circles, I finally spotted the faint glow of my campfire through the trees. A wave of relief washed over me. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. I wasn't lost. I just had to take a deep breath and calm down. When I reached the clearing, I saw the fire crackling away, just like I had left it. But something was wrong. The air was unnaturally still, and I didn't hear the usual sounds of the woods. No rustling leaves.
No chirping crickets.
No distant hoots from owls. It was quiet, too quiet. The fire burned steadily, but there was something off about the way the shadows played around it. They seemed longer, stretching further than they should have. I stepped closer to my tent, and that's when I noticed it. My gear was scattered around, things knocked over as if someone, or something, had been rummaging through my stuff. My backpack was open, the contents spilled out, and my water bottle was missing. My first thought was that maybe an animal had gotten into it, but then I realized that everything was just too neat, too organized in the way it was disturbed. The way my sleeping bag had been tugged out of the tent and left half folded on the ground made my skin crawl. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if maybe someone else had set up camp nearby, but I quickly dismissed that thought. I hadn't seen another soul all day. The nearest campgrounds were miles away, and I hadn't heard a car in hours. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I decided to check the perimeter. I grabbed my flashlight and took slow, careful steps toward the edge of the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, flickering across the trunks of trees. Everything looked fine at first, but then I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, just outside the camp. It was like someone had walked around in circles, their footprints deeply pressed into the soft earth. They weren't animal tracks, they were too large, too human. I froze. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone else be out here? Was it some sort of prank? Or worse, someone who knew I was alone and was trying to intimidate me? A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I had no cell service, and I wasn't about to go searching the woods at night, especially after finding those footprints. I decided to pack up my things and leave. The thought of staying out there, with the unease growing stronger by the second, was unbearable. But as I started to gather my belongings, the unmistakable sound of something snapping a twig behind me stopped me dead in my tracks. I wasn't imagining it. The crack of the wood was real, and it was close. Too close. I spun around, flashing the light in every direction. There was nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. My breath came out in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood frozen, listening for any more sounds, but the woods were still, too still. Minutes dragged by, but I didn't dare make a sound. Slowly, I started to back away toward my tent, trying not to make any noise, but my foot caught on a tree root, sending me stumbling. The flashlight flickered wildly, casting odd shadows that made it impossible to see clearly. I righted myself and quickly zipped up my tent, locking it, though I knew it wouldn't help if someone or something really wanted to get in. I lay there, wide awake, my body tense, straining to hear any sound. The crackling of the fire was the only noise, but even that seemed too loud in the silence. It was impossible to relax, Then, a soft rustling sound came from outside the tent. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. The noise was deliberate, too slow to be an animal. My thoughts raced. Was someone circling the camp? The sound grew closer, and I felt my pulse spike. I grabbed the flashlight, but my hand shook so violently that I almost dropped it. The rustling stopped just outside my tent. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening, holding my breath. Then nothing.
No footsteps.
No sound at all. I felt my body relax, just a little. Maybe it was just an animal after all. Maybe I was being paranoid. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but every creak of the trees outside, every snap of a twig, kept me on edge. I kept my flashlight beside me, my hand hovering over it, ready to grab it at a moment's notice. Hours passed, and it wasn't until the first light of dawn that I dared to finally unzip the tent. The camp was exactly as I'd left it. The fire had burned out, and everything appeared untouched. But the air felt different. The strange tension was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. I quickly packed my things and left, not once looking back at the forest behind me. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I can tell you this: I never went camping alone again. It was supposed to be just another camping trip, something simple to get away from the noise of daily life. I'd made plans to camp deep in the woods, away from any distractions, with nothing but the sound of nature and the company of the trees. I thought it'd be the perfect weekend to recharge, just me and my backpack, a tent, and the forest around me. I'd chosen the spot after a bit of research, a secluded area marked on the map, far enough from the usual hiking trails, but still accessible. The last time I had camped, I'd been with a group, and it was noisy, filled with laughter and chatter. This time, I wanted quiet. I wanted peace. But sometimes, when you seek peace in places like these, you find something else entirely. The sun had just begun to dip below the treetops as I set up camp, the sky turning that deep shade of orange you only get in late afternoon. The air was crisp, cool, and the forest smelled like damp earth and pine. I unloaded my gear, set up the tent in a small clearing, and arranged my things. There was no one else around. Not a single person had passed by since I'd arrived, and the only sounds I could hear were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Once the tent was up, I decided to take a quick walk to explore the area. The trees stood tall and thick, their trunks twisted in ways that seemed almost unnatural, but I didn't give it much thought. The trail wasn't well marked, and I had to push through underbrush to get through. I came across a small stream and knelt down to take a drink, cupping my hands to scoop the clear, cold water. It was refreshing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, thinking about how lucky I was to have this moment of solitude. I didn't know how long I'd been out when I finally decided to head back to camp. The sun had set fully now, and the forest was dark. The moon hadn't risen yet, and it felt like the world had been swallowed by shadows. It wasn't until I turned around to retrace my steps that I felt a strange sense of discomfort. Something wasn't right. At first, I told myself it was just the quiet. I was used to city noise, the hum of cars and the chatter of people, so maybe the silence of the woods was playing tricks on me. But as I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle, the way the air around me seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. I kept walking, telling myself I was overreacting. The sounds of the forest continued, but they weren't comforting now. They were unsettling, as if something was watching me. By the time I reached my camp, I was on edge. It didn't help that the fire I'd left burning had nearly gone out, leaving only the glowing embers. I stoked it back to life, throwing a couple of small logs onto the fire. The light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the trees. I sat down by the fire, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but it wouldn't go away. I felt exposed. The woods around me, once so peaceful, now felt like they were closing in. I spent the next few hours trying to distract myself. I made a small dinner, boiling some water for a freeze-dried meal. As I ate, I kept glancing into the trees, as if I expected something to appear, though I couldn't say what. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Darkness fully settled over the forest, the kind of dark that swallows you up, where you can barely see your hand in front of your face. I climbed into my tent, zipped myself in, and lay there, listening to the crackling of the fire outside and the occasional rustle in the woods. But the sounds were wrong. There was something else mixed in now, something like footsteps, but not like the animals I had seen earlier. These steps were heavier, more deliberate. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart racing. There was no way anyone else could be out here. I had been in this part of the woods for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone. The trail was far enough that it wouldn't make sense for anyone to have stumbled upon my camp by accident. Yet, the sounds persisted, moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. They weren't close enough to be dangerous, but they were close enough to make my skin crawl. I forced myself to stay calm. If I stayed in the tent, I would be trapped. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharper now, and the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in a way that made everything seem even more alive. I scanned the woods around me, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. No figures, no eyes staring back at me, just trees and shadows. But the footsteps, they were still there, louder now, coming from the direction of the trees just outside the camp. I froze, listening. They weren't animal tracks. This was something else. Someone, or something, was moving deliberately through the woods, just beyond my sight. I turned back to the campfire, hoping it might offer some kind of reassurance. The flames danced, flickering in the wind, but there was no comfort in its glow anymore. My throat tightened, and I had a sudden urge to pack up, to leave this place and never return. But I couldn't. My gear was scattered around, and I couldn't shake the thought that if I left now, whatever was out there might follow me. I stood there, staring into the woods, my mind racing. Should I stay, or should I leave? I debated for what felt like hours, but the decision was made for me when I heard something new. A low, guttural sound, like a grunt, but not human. It came from the trees, close enough to make my stomach drop. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen in place. Then, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, louder now. It was coming closer, and whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. Panic set in. I grabbed my pack, ready to make a run for it, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the fire behind. Something told me that if I ran, I wouldn't make it far enough. But I couldn't just stand there either. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. The air seemed to hold its breath, the forest around me silent for a long moment. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, barely visible, blending into the dark trees. It wasn't a person, not fully. It was tall, too tall, with broad shoulders and a strange, animal-like gait. It stepped into the clearing just outside the range of the firelight, and my heart stopped. I could barely make out its features, but I saw enough to know that it wasn't something I wanted to see up close. It wasn't moving fast, just slowly stepping forward, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. The figure didn't advance, though. It just watched, and for the first time since I had arrived, I realized that the woods were not empty. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, as silently as it had come. My legs finally unlocked, and I stumbled back to the fire, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, staring into the darkness, too afraid to close my eyes. The sounds of the forest seemed different now, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I don't know when, but eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything in a rush, barely thinking, just needing to get out of there. I didn't look back until I was well past the woods, back on the main trail where I could see the light of day creeping in. The strange figure never followed me, and by the time I reached my car, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was some kind of animal, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to those woods again. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some things are better left undisturbed. And as for the sounds I heard, I don't know if I'll ever fully understand them, but I do know this. I wasn't alone in the woods that night, and I'm not sure I ever will be again.